Hello, we are live. I am joined today by Stephen Boyce. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on.
Yes, Stephen. It's good.
It's
It's
good to
I've
have.
actually never done a show with another Stephen before. It's so crazy.
Really, not even a Stephen who misspells the name with a V.
With a V. Yeah. I've been in a panel with another Stephen spelled with a V, but I've never actually done just like a mano y mano discussion. And today just so happens to be the feast of Saint Stephen on the calendar for the church. So Stephen, and our names are spelled with the
Yes,
PH. So
yes.
it's kind of an all Stephen's day, so to speak.
And you know why that it's spelled with a PH?
Are you going to educate us on our spelling? All right, go ahead.
Yes,
Carry
yes. It's
on. Carry
because
on.
it's because because it's a Greek name because it's Stephanos
Yes, it is. It comes from
and
the language of the Greek, but modern English has changed a lot of the pronunciations. In fact, I've gotten to the point where if I'm at Starbucks or something, I'll sit there. And my kids did this the other day. They're like, "Is that Stephen with a PH or a V?" And I'll say V, and my kids will look at me like, "Dad, you don't know how to spell your own name." And then they finally understand because when I tell them PH, the person that finishes the coffee will announce my name as Stefan almost always. So
yeah,
I just went ahead and told the baristas, yeah, it's a V, because
that's
at least
funny.
they'll pronounce it right by the end of the day. So that's just kind of become the norm for me now.
Yeah, well, I usually say a PH thank you, and I thank them for asking.
I've gotten to that point, but when everybody mispronounces it, and I'm just like, oh, so I just go ahead and go along with it anyway. But either way, it's good. It's good to do the show. I'm looking forward to this discussion. A lot of my friends are involved in some of the controversy,
Yeah.
so it'll be fun to kind of break this down.
Well, we have so okay. It is the feast of Saint Stephen, and it is my birthday tomorrow.
Wow.
So I got a couple of early birthday gifts. One is from Derek Lambert at Myth Vision Podcast. Congrats on getting monetized. Happy birthday. Q for Dr. Boyce. How can we know undesigned coincidences exist for sure when we know the Gospels know each other? So we will definitely be getting into
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. It's a good question.
Also, $10 from my wife, Anna. Thank you very much, Anna. She's got her Cross Bible brand up and running. And also, Derek said this should be interesting. I'm obviously of the critical scholarly perspective with McClellan, but I have much respect for both you guys and look forward to what is said. And I have 11 people watching, which is one more than usual. Thank you very much for the birthday wishes.
Well, for
And
fun facts, the Orthodox Church will be acknowledging St. Stephen tomorrow on your birthday. So the Catholics are today, tomorrow's Orthodox. So you get to celebrate it somewhere with the saint. So good job for you.
yeah, I mean it's generally a pretty depressing time to have a birthday. Usually, it's like you get a group of presents, and then like a few get set aside for your birthday, and then you spend most of the year celebrating your friends' birthdays, and then when your birthday comes around, it's just there is no celebration because everybody's on Christmas break. So what is your background? Because I have to say that I have spent years watching you on various podcasts and
Mhm.
on your channel, and I am an admirer, and like I really respect you know the depth of knowledge that you bring to some of these issues, which is why I really look forward to getting your perspective on some of this. Um, but where like what is your educational background? Like how did you like get into this? Can you
Sure.
kind of because some people might not be familiar with you who are in my audience.
Yeah. So oddly enough, I grew up in a very, very conservative Baptist background,
Hmm.
independent, fundamental, King James only
Oh wow.
Baptist world. Yeah.
Okay.
I did most of my early life in that world.
Me too.
Became
Me too.
very fascinated with the subject of the critical text and the Textus Receptus, which is, if anybody's in the King James only world, they know what that is. And so I became fascinated with guys like Scrivener with his text and Theodore Beza in the 1550 edition, as well as his 1551, which introduced the verse content to us. So I got very fascinated in the Greek language, transmission of the text, started following that trend even into my master's work, which about that point I was already a pastor. I started pastoring a church very, very young at 21 years old. Started working through that. and finished my master's about 3 years later into that pastorate. Started doctoral work while I was pastoring that church. Then I ended up becoming a Southern Baptist pastor about a year after that had happened. So I was in the Independent Baptist world as a pastor for 4, and then I started a Southern Baptist church. Was doing very, very well. The church grew really quickly in a very quick period of time, about a year. It tripled in size. And a lot of issues, like just there were some family issues. There was also some major issues in relation to my understanding of the Baptist teachings and ecclesiology. At that point, I had started studying really a corpus of documents from the 2nd and 3rd century, which led me into another doctoral program in Louisiana. What I ended up doing is studying particularly the Gnostic groups of that time. And I use that word very loosely because there's a lot of nuance, but for the sake of argument, Gnostic ideas in the 2nd, 3rd century, especially the Nag Hammadi corpus. And I also had to write a lot of textual analysis for Codex H, which is in Jerusalem, which contains our full first copy that's come down to us of Greek Didache, as well as, First and Clement, the longer recensions of Ignatius. So I did all the textual analysis for that. I wrote over 300-something pages of doctoral dissertation, covering the data between the texts that they were quoting, comparing it to our modern texts today and our textual critical work. And so I was able to do that, which I use pretty much every week in my life now as it relates to podcasting or discussion or defending Christianity and its early transmission of the text. So a lot of that was a big deal. And then that just kind of got me launched into the apologetic world while doing that. So I started debating a lot of things on gospel reliability, New Testament reliability. Then it turned into Old Testament reliability. Led to a lot of good debates within Christianity, outside of Christianity. By that time, I'd already converted out of the Baptist world and become an Anglican. Worked through that process, became an Anglican apologist for about 3 years. Just recently converted through the Anglican Ordinariate in full communion with Rome. So most of my research is going to be from that perspective. But I really just wanted to keep the main thing. My podcast is called Facts, which is a kind of play on words in an acronym. Fathers, apocryphal, canon, text, and scripture. So we focus on anything like that. These are subjects we like to deal with. Like I said, a lot of the guys that are in the discussion today are friends of mine, done a lot of podcasting debates, been on their channels. They've been on my channel. We've had a lot of conversations about this kind of stuff. So that's basically what I do. I mean, that's mainly what I do as far as podcasting goes.
And what did you study in your undergrad?
My undergrad was particularly New Testament studies. I started out as a pastoral major, moved to theology of the New Testament because I wasn't sure if I was going to be a pastor, and then I ended up being a pastor anyway. Again, I look back at those days and cringe at some of the ideas. But mostly I started out as a pastoral major, moved to theology, did my master's in New Testament studies, particularly focusing on Luke, Acts, and Hebrews. And then moved into the doctoral program, focused particularly on the textual analysis of the early church, being the apostolic fathers mostly.
Okay. Well, my undergraduate is in Russian literature. I have 0 credentials with respect to the New Testament or Greek or any of the things that I do as a hobbyist. So I will definitely be learning more from you than you from me. But I do, I do obviously, my background is also from the sort of conservative Baptist perspective, not KJV onlyist, but I definitely, I think, I don't even remember, to be honest, like if there was like a particular, I think ESV was probably used a lot.
That was a big Southern Baptist one for sure, but yeah.
Yeah, so Southern Baptist was the variety of Baptist,
and then the CSB came out, and that was, their baby from the Holman. Yeah.
Well, and so are you brand new to Cross Bible, the platform? Like, you're familiar with it at all?
Yeah, I mean, Derek had introduced it to myself and a few others maybe a year ago. It's probably close to a year now. I looked at it, reviewed it. I think you did a video with him and Neil. I think it was you, him, and Neil perhaps did something together discussing it. So definitely was introduced to it. Then you sent me some more information about a month ago. So I've been looking at that a little bit more as well. So I'm fairly new to the subject for sure.
All right. Well, and I'm sure a lot of people will complain if I do too much shameless promotion right off the bat. But I will just mention that the timeline of the Bible does have this interactive version that you in particular may find interesting. Have you ever seen this?
No, I
Yeah, so
haven't.
this is color coded. This is a color coded history of the transmission of the text. This whole
Nice.
section here is the New Testament, and the top section is the Old Testament. And you can see here sort of the split of the different, traditional
Hmm.
text types, the Western text, the Alexandrian, the Byzantine text type, and then flowing
Hmm.
into the Textus Receptus, and then the transition from the Textus Receptus to the modern critical period, and sort of showing how, the genealogy of all of the different forms of
Yeah,
the
that's
Bible
good
that we have
stuff.
today.
That's very good stuff because it's not as clean as some people wanted to make it. It's also not as out in left field as others try to make it, where it's like, well, we don't know what the original autographs or what the, as I like to call them, initial text would have perhaps looked like.
Yeah.
I think that there are two extremes as it relates to the textual analysis and the transmission of the New Testament that gets overstated and overkilled, especially when the papyri were discovered and we're able to now look at things from the late 2nd century into the 3rd, kind of see some of the bridging and the gap, say from like P75 to Codex Vaticanus, for example, very, very close, separated by 100 plus years, seem to come from a similar family. So we can kind of categorize families. Families seem to show a faithful transmission of scribes over a period of time and locations. Those things are overlooked sometimes and made simple by some, but too complicated by others. I think it's a healthy balance. So I'm really glad that you've got all that put together. It's a good deal.
Well, and so far, I think we've had like 100 orders in the last few months of
Wow,
the poster. So
that's great.
I have a wall poster version of that, which was featured on a useful charts video back in June that got like 60,000 views or something, and it's actually been probably it's more popular than the software itself. So
Somebody said Beza was my boy. Yeah. The King James version predominantly used the 1598 edition of
yeah,
Beza. I mean, they held, three there, particularly the main ones in Greek were Beza, going into Stephanus, Stevens. And then since it's the Stevens day, we might as well add Stephanus in there. So Stevens or Stephanus 1551 gave us the verse content. Beza later in the 1590s, he was the successor of John Calvin.
right.
He gave us the more extensive that the translators of the King James were using in 1604. Now that part of it becomes interesting, but really they use mostly Beza's 1598 with some nuance of the 1550 of Stephanus, and then a little bit of Erasmus, because Erasmus had 5 editions. The first one was atrocious. But when you're looking at that, but then the Competentia Polyglot was also involved, which is a multi-translation view. Hey, it's on your screen. I see it right there. Cool. There's a Competentia Polyglot right there. Yeah. Beautiful work. It was a beautifully done work. It just took a long time to get a papal approval.
Yeah. So you can see here that Stephanus was taking readings from the Complutensian Polyglot and Erasmus, right? Like he was sort of consolidating everything, but favoring Erasmus. And then you had Beza, and then you had Elzevir. And, the sort of Elzevir is basically, back reading from the King James. So this is considered sort of the Textus Receptus. Elzevir is considered Textus Receptus sort of par excellence.
Well, that's where it got its name. Yeah.
Yeah. That's this
Their
is
publication.
the received text, and everything else, like everything that flows from it, like Scrivener, for example, and, all these other ones, they're basically just expanding the apparatus. Like they're not really overthrowing Elzevir at that point.
No. Scrivener's just trying to find a consistent Greek text with the Greek, for the Greek with the translation of the King James. And in fact, he just goes back through and sees which choices the translators made between Beza and Stephanus. And so I'm one of the few people that I know of. Timothy Berg and I did a project. Man, this has been 4 or 5 years ago now. We actually translated and made it more English favorable to his appendices to go through the sections where he actually chose Stephanus over Beza in places showing where the King James was picking Stephanus over Beza. And I actually demonstrate in his very last pick of Revelation that the Scrivener made a mistake. which I use against King James onlys all the time. It's like, well, they both can't be perfect because Scrivener messed up here. It's a minor mix up, but it's still a mistake in translation at the end of the day if they chose one over the other. So anyway, boy, you just took me back in time. I'm like, I just did a time lapse, and I haven't touched TR issues in a while. And now I'm just questioning, like earlier, did I get Beza and Stephanus mixed up? I may have. And if I did, I apologize.
Well,
It has been a while.
If you ever end up having to explain it to somebody and you want a visual aid, I would appreciate
It's like, let me take you down this chart.
plug. Yeah. It's a good, I use it in my content, obviously, because it's sort of self-promotion, but it is helpful to have a visual aid to explain this to people.
Somebody said papal approval, probably not the best way to go about it. Well, you got to understand, you had to have royalties. I mean, everything was held by royalties. And what Erasmus did to expedite his, even though it came after and it was very sloppy, is he dedicated his to the Pope. I mean, that's one way to get it passed quicker. So by dedicating it as a gift to the Pope, his got passed quicker than the polyglot, which was sitting in a cellar waiting for papal approval. Royalties worked that way. It wasn't a matter of like, should we or shouldn't we? It's like, no, you want that published, you have to. That was the publishing house of the time, if you would.
Have you ever seen any of the cross Bible content I've produced on the channel, like the King James, the Textus Receptus video or any of that?
Yeah, I actually, since we connected, I went and watched a couple things just out of curiosity. So I figured you were happy about this kind of conversation, but I know it's not the point of today, but it's fun to at least get that introduced.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's look at undesigned coincidences. Now, this is a slideshow that I've put together in advance of the discussion, which I plan on probably revising after the discussion if there are any insights that I feel like are missing from this or are not accurate. And I will be putting all of my conclusions or my summary of the research in on Patreon. So it'll be a patron-only offering. So for the people who are already on Patreon, you're going to get that hopefully in the next few days. If you're not on Patreon, feel free to support us there. Or at the very least, just drop a like on this video and subscribe. And this is the very, very first live stream we're doing where we actually have super chats enabled. So thank you to everybody who helped make that possible by just watching the content and helping us hit that milestone. So first of all, the dispute. I am very, very glad that this is coming up because for me, like anytime the Gospels come back into the zeitgeist and the cultural conversation, I think it's great. I think it's, regardless of whether or not people end up siding on one side or the other, I think it's awesome. Like I appreciate the work that Dan McClellan does and the work that Wes Huff does. And like, I think everybody's just doing a great job shining a spotlight on something that needs to be discussed. And we're probably not going to do what a lot of other people have done, which is just sort of play video clips of Dan McClellan and then play, I don't want to do a point by point review of any video content today because I'm more interested in just getting Stephen's perspective on this. But I will kind of summarize, this is again, like the links are going to be here for people to go back and watch. And like, I just want to put together like an index of everything that's happened so far. And I believe that this summary more or less accurately represents what Dan's criticisms have been so far. Right. So his overall assessment, well, first of all, what I don't have here is a slide or two that's actually explaining what undesigned coincidences are. And so I think maybe you might want to clarify before I go into these points that Dan made, pushing back on undesigned coincidences. Maybe we take a step back and sort of explain what they are, first of all.
Yeah, go ahead and give a rundown. I mean, actually, I think on your slide with Wes, he actually gives I think you had his rundown.
Okay, let's start there because so Wes, his response,
and it's not extensive, but it gives us the bullet points to work.
Yeah, I mean, so he says that Dan's critiques are already addressed in the literature. He criticized Dan for not responding to basically to Lydia McGrew's book on the topic, and
which is a big proponent. She's a big proponent of it. Jonathan McClatchy, also a big proponent of this, has written articles and all kinds of documentation as related to what he believes are.
Yeah. And so Wes Huff has mentioned the following scholars: William Paley, Joseph Lightfoot, William Ramsey, Adolph Harnack, Henry Cadbury, Frederick Bruce, Colin Hemer, and Craig Keener as either directly promoting undesigned coincidences or at least tangentially having ideas that promote it, right? Or mentioning it, right?
Yeah. And one of the biggest issues that came up was like McClellan's fight was, well, this isn't, something in publications, right? And so I don't know if you still have it. I actually sent you, I talked to Wes about it. Wes and I went back and forth. I don't remember how many nights ago this was, Stephen, maybe 3 days ago, 2 days ago. And we knew we were going on this. And so I kind of told him, I said, hey, I'm going on a channel with, Stephen Nelson. We're going to be talking about the back and forth between you. He said he was kind of done dealing with McClellan on it. He answered what he needed to, but he went ahead and put out on his X account. I'm pretty sure it was his X account, a statement to say that this is not, part of peer-reviewed papers is disingenuous. And he gave examples. I'm pretty sure I sent you the post, so you could even add a few more names in there. And okay. If so, I can pull it up if you're not able to pull it up. But Wes went ahead, kind of for our benefit for today, went ahead and put a post out for clarification.
And this is a clarification that basically what Wes was saying, I think the way that this ended up breaking down is from Wes's perspective. He provided examples for, why he thinks, John likely used Mark, why the green grass and the feeding of the 5,000, that fits a literary motif from Psalm 23. He says that the crowds are explained internally by Mark, and we're going to get into all these issues. From his perspective, there is no unresolved puzzle that requires another gospel to solve. Like you don't need Matthew to explain Mark or Luke to explain Matthew or Luke to explain John. Yeah. That everything is internally explicable, mainly through.
These undesigned coincidences are basically you find agreements with either two or more documents, right? So whether you're talking about the Gospels, you're looking at Luke and Galatians or Luke and 2 Corinthians or something like that. You have two texts or documents that agree with each other, but they're based on events, places, locations, numbers, concepts, something like that, but they're incidental agreements. They're not like, copy and paste or dependency, but rather isolated independent thoughts that just coincidentally line up without like corroborating or any kind of work of conspiracy, but that basically they come together and they offer different perspectives, but they end up agreeing with each other at the same time. Like, so if you're looking for an elementary explanation of undesigned coincidences, it's you have multiple texts or more than one text agreeing incidentally on things, numbers, people, places, concepts. They end up working out without like any kind of corroborated effort, with any kind of dependency. They're independent acts that are working together and they just happen to work out. And there's other places like that are being worked on. This isn't just something that's happening in the New Testament. There's people working this with Josephus. There's other documents where this is being done with as well, Tacitus. So, I think it's a unique study. I do think that you can make two extremes here. I think you can blow it out of proportion and make everything an undesigned coincidence when there just so happens to be agreement on some of those unique places. And then there can be a second extreme here, and that is that you wave the hand dismiss the probability of incidental agreement between 2, 3, or 4 texts, whatever the number may be, where you lack the ability to say that there are separate accounts here that have different purposes or a different insight or a different idea that's going on here, but they contain, without like intentionally meaning to, the same sustenance, the same idea, or the same event, or the same number, or the same miracle, whatever it is. And so I think to wave the hand at that is overly dismissive. To embrace all things that look like that is a little bit too well-rounded in the sense of saying, well, then all of these are just undesigned coincidences. Well, maybe, I don't think that we should be overly dogmatic about all, but should make the probability cases that these could exist.
Now, if I'm properly conveying Dan's concerns, he says that even if we grant that there is interlocking between the gospels, that merely demonstrates that there is a shared underlying tradition, be it oral or written, and that does not entail that there were independent witnesses. And the funny thing is that if you based on the last few days of going back through this and rereading McClatchy's articles and re-reviewing all this stuff, the only thing, the missing piece here is I have not read Lydia McGrew's book, so I know that that's the authoritative source that I should analyze to give a firm opinion on this. But it seems like the idea of there being shared tradition is something that all of the proponents of undesigned coincidences and people arguing it against it, they share that assumption that, like, we all agree that there are underlying shared traditions. It's just a question of whether or not those traditions are reliably conveying historical data, right? Like that they're reliable underlying traditions.
Here's the problem. If the gospels are automatically put in a no-win situation in some of the scholarship today, because if they agree with each other, they're just copying and pasting. If they differ with each other, then they contradict each other. If they have nuance from each other, they're still depending on each other, but there's like this explanation for it away. And so no matter which way you put the synoptics side by side, or if you even add the Johannine gospel into the equation, the gospels have no chance of winning in most critical scholarship today, like no chance. And so what ends up happening is, on the Christian side of things, is we feel like we have to go to the defense of one of those categories. And what ends up happening is we get so fascinated for periods of time because it's like the new buzzword. Undesigned coincidence is the buzzword for 6 to 8 months. Next thing you know, it's gospel contradictions. The next thing you know, we go into gospel dependency. Now we're talking about whether the gospels are independent sources or they're dependent sources. Are they just, all borrowing from each other, or do they have isolated eyewitness testimony? Or are they later legend? Are they myth? Are they using Homer? Like it seems like every single like gap of time, we go through these same rotations of having to look at the gospels through these different categories and criteria. My concern is that we've made no progress at communicating our points from either side of the equation, where guys like Dan or Wes or whoever, McClatchy, they're all talking over each other. And when you listen to most of the videos that get put out on this, my friend Eric Manning, these are guys I think are fantastic. Than is doing a great job with IP. He's doing a lot of work on this right now. What ends up happening is these guys end up talking over each other. And I mean, I'm going to throw myself in there. We end up talking over each other, and we're missing the actual point. And I think the reason we talk over each other is because we already know where the argument is going to go, and we have to already start defending it ahead of time. And what that doesn't do is that doesn't open the door for us to have academic conversations where we find common ground, where we can concede certain points and say, hey, on the side of undesigned coincidences, I will grant X, Y, and Z because there is reason to come up with a hypothesis that is credible here. On the other hand, we could be killing that too much, where everything is an undesigned coincidence when it's not. And I think that scholarship is struggling with balance today, and that's probably because our political realm is struggling with balance. Our academic realm is struggling with balance. So I think that there's a certain point, Stephen, where we need to be able to sit down as really more in the sense of scholars and gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen sitting down around a table and just saying, let's figure out where we can actually identify agreeable content. Let's start there. And then where we differ, we state where we differ and why we differ. And then we just freaking move on. I mean, sometimes it's so complex and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of this overlooks, a lot of the discussion has overlooked the agreement that people do have. For example, as far as I can tell, Dan McClellan, Lady McGrew, Jonathan McClatchy, like all of them agree on certain core premises. Like I think they all, they're all in favor of Markan priority. They all believe that Matthew knew Mark and that Luke knew Mark and that they copied from Mark and rewrote Mark to some degree. Like there are some fundamental agreements between them. It's just the disagreements are over the motivations for the changes and what we can infer from the changes. But I don't think any of them are going out on a limb with something that's completely fringe with respect to, like, I don't know, like Mark and priority is something they all agree on. So I think just to get past. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, but to do what Dan did and just continue to go out and say, like, well, this doesn't have any, peer-reviewed work to it, therefore we should dismiss it, is a waving the hand and part of the problem, because at the end of the day, that's not even true. And that's why Wes went out of his way to tweet that, even though he was kind of done engaging it, and listed certain journals or sections of books that are published where these types of arguments are being made, maybe not in a full document by itself, but in isolated places within a chapter of a book or within a section in a peer-reviewed article. And he posted that not because of if we have 50 on our side and 20 on the other, then we're in the right and you're in the wrong thing, as much as like the problem is that when somebody comes out and starts to make the argument of, well, this is not a part of peer-reviewed thought, therefore we should dismiss the whole thing. Whether Dan meant that or not, when you wave the hand with that kind of thing, when it's even not true, when you do that, that then becomes a dismissive argument rather than an engaging argument. And I'm not saying people on the other end of this aren't dismissing either. We all do it. I'm admitting we all do it. But that kind of engagement is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Well, I think Dan's first video, which was just a response to, this whole thing started with Wes posting a clip of a lecture where he just conveyed the idea of undesigned coincidences. He did. Pasted on the green grass and Mark. Yep. And it was just a lecture. And, Dan had a response to that. And after that, like this slide you see here is just sort of the points that I gathered from Dan's first video. After that, it was all a debate of like Wes saying, but Dan, you're not paying it, you're ignorant of the scholarship on this. And Dan was saying, what scholarship? And Wes was saying, Jonathan McClatchy and Lydia McGrew. And Dan was saying, that's not scholarship. And then they just went back and forth on what classifies as the scholarship. And they completely lost.
Which I hate. I hate that part of the argument, because we did that. What ends up being lost in transmission? The actual content we're trying to discuss.
Yeah,
because now it's like, well, are they a true scholar? Are they a fake scholar? Or what makes them a scholar?
But to be fair, like his first video was, conveying certain points that needed to deserve a response, and the response didn't come like that. Like Wes did not respond to these points. He simply just said, "Well, I'm not. This isn't originating from me. Go read these sources." And then Dan was just questioning the validity of those sources rather than, like at that point, they were just talking past each other. Like the last few videos in the discussion were not productive. So just to get past this slide, these are the explanations he provided. We're going to get into the text. So for the feeding of the 5,000, he believes that John was likely using Mark. The green grass fits a literary motif, citing Psalm 23. We'll get to that. The crowds are explained internally. There's no unresolved puzzle that needs another gospel to understand another gospel. And then in terms of Philip and Bethsaida, again, we're going to discuss this, but he believes that John uses Philip as a representative disciple whose misunderstanding allows Jesus's identity and mission to be clarified for the reader. That's sort of my take on what I think he is reasoning in terms of why John uses Philip or names Philip, which has a different explanation under the undesigned coincidences. Mark places Bethsaida after the feeding, so Mark 6:45 compared to Luke 9:10, while with Luke placing the feeding at Bethsaida, so that could be, there's some tension there. And then undesigned coincidences work only by privileging Luke over Mark, and that weakens the claim of independence or accidental corroboration. So that's my slide on Dan. Wes's whole point, his rebuttals are not really rebuttals. They're just kind of trying to divert to the people who are authoritative on this, because Wes is not really bringing anything new to the discussion. He's simply promoting the work of Jonathan McClatchy and Lydia McGrew, right? So he doesn't want a video response escalation, especially over Christmas. Like a lot of people criticized him for copping out of or at least like not getting into a debate with Dan. But I think from his perspective, there just really wasn't anything to debate. Like this wasn't his fight. It was just like this whole thing started where he just made a video illustrating undesigned coincidences. And after Dan's response, Wes's response to that was like, well, you just need to be more familiar with, like you need to respond to Jonathan McClatchy, basically. Like this is something that should be in between Dan, McClatchy, and McGrew, and Wes Huff is just the messenger here. I would say that because McClatchy did respond to Wes Huff in a blog post, and I'm going to link everything in the slideshow. So if you're on Patreon, you'll get access to these slides, and my notes under the slides will have the hyperlinks. So here, I think my best distillation of this is that while literary dependency and oral tradition can explain some overlap, they do not adequately explain the pattern selectively and causally interlocking seen across the gospel and Acts material, right? So undesigned coincidences are best explained by authors having independent access to real events, which is the underlying tradition that Dan also concedes probably existed, even if they also used shared sources, right? So again, I think there's agreement across the board that there's underlying tradition. The question is, how reliable is that tradition? And does the interlocking inherently entail that the underlying tradition is reliable from a historical perspective?
Yep.
So and then he notes points of disagreement and agreement. So the key thing, which is something that Dan recently touched on, is that McClatchy does agree with Dan that with McClellan that no comprehensive peer-reviewed treatment of undesigned coincidences yet exists, right? This is a gap in the literature. So it's not by simply identifying that fact, it doesn't, refute it inherently. And I think this was something that Wes got a little too defensive about, like how dare you insinuate that there's no scholarship, there's all of, there are these blog posts and there is this book. And then Dan's whole response to that was, well, that's not real scholarship. Like they went back and forth on that. And then McClatchy just pretty much conceded that, like, yeah, this is a problem. We're working on this. And you mentioned that somebody is publishing something under peer review.
Well, I mean, yeah, so they're going to be submitting it. So Than and a group of guys, and I'll leave them anonymous at this point because it's not my place to mention other than Than. They're working on it, obviously, and there are peer-reviewed sections that deal with this. Craig Keener is one of them. Luke Vandewey is one of them. So all of these guys have, I mean, it's fairly recent material too. It's not like something that's been around for 50 years. It's something that's been around for like 5 at the best. And so Keener's going into some of this stuff a little bit more. Luke Vandewey is going into this. There's a group of academics at certain universities that are, again, working together to submit. And it's not just for the New Testament. Again, it's others like Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus. I mean, they're doing it and getting percentages based on, the Gospels, Acts, or looking at, the Jewish wars. And so they're trying to get the data comparatively for all of it. So that's why I said it's a little disingenuous to say that, like, oh, well, there's no peer-reviewed work. Like, okay, let's just say it's not. I mean, that doesn't answer what's being done here, even if that's the case. It's not the case. There is recent, again, it's in smaller sections of books that are peer-reviewed. It's subsections of papers, not whole entire documents, which is what Jonathan McClatchy is talking about. So again, it's something that's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to increase. And when the data comes back, which I have been able to see sections of, and it's pretty extraordinary, when you see the percentages come back, I would expect to see in the next year to 2 years. And you look at it, it's going to be overwhelmingly obvious that there's some sort of criteria that is being met to this. Now, I think what's going to end up happening is when the data comes back, those that defend the undesigned coincidences are going to have to adjust their criteria a little bit based on the data. So they're going to have to back up and punt on some places. In other places, they're going to be able to really strengthen their arguments. So these things are going to come up. I think these things are going to continue to happen. I don't think the waving of the hand is a good method right now, because I think it's going to make you look a little bit silly later when the data comes in. And again, I've seen it in sections. I've seen it in sections of Acts already. It's not public. It will be. It's coming. I'm not just like saying this. Like, I mean, you can choose not to believe me at this point, but when it comes out, you'll remember this video and go, oh, I think Stephen and Stephen talked about this. It's going to come out. You're going to see the data. It's going to be published. It is being peer reviewed. When it is ready, you're going to be able to read the data, and you're not going to be able to just wave the hand at it.
Well, and I think the last point of agreement I wanted to mention was that literary dependence is not collusion. So this is something, I think you used the word collusion a little earlier. I know that Wes also in his presentation, if I'm not mistaken, used the word collusion just to show that, hey, there's an explanation for these discrepancies or these overlaps that does not involve sitting down and colluding, or, you know, like this word collude and collusion gets used a lot. And I think Dan criticized that as a kind of straw man fallacy, and McClatchy, Jonathan McClatchy corroborated, agreed with Dan that yes, that we're not actually talking about collusion. And specifically what I mean is, this is one of my favorite diagrams that, illustrate Matthew's use of Mark and Luke's use of Mark, and then obviously the overlap between Luke and Matthew, like the synoptic problem, right? If in the standard model of the synoptic problem, where Matthew is reworking Mark for his own purpose for whatever reason, and then Luke is reworking Mark and potentially either reworking Matthew or some shared underlying source like Q, we don't need to get into too many details there. That is not collusion. Like that is not them sitting around a table and getting together and saying, oh, you're going to include this detail and I'm going to omit this detail. No, this is the author of Matthew probably revering Mark, knowing Mark, probably had it practically memorized and just had his own spin on it, maybe had it open in front of him so that he could take the pieces verbatim that he needed, but interweave his own material in there. That is not collusion. Like that is literary dependence. And those ideas are distinct, and it's not like that there's no sort of conspiracy theory required for that, because as we're going to see when we look at the synoptic parallels, that I have heard people argue that no, they like these gospels are independent, and that, that's a whole other can of worms. But basically nobody involved on either side of this discussion is arguing that the gospels are independent or that they are not, in fact, rewriting each other, right?
Well, I would say that there are places where the gospels are independent from each other. I mean, that's where you get M source, L source. I mean, this idea. But again, why is Mark the first one? Why is Mark the one that continually gets utilized by Matthew and Luke? See, from a historical perspective of those that are on the inside that defend it from a historical view, we believe that Mark's gospel was a written account of Peter's sermons that were preached in Rome. This comes everywhere from Papias to Clement of Alexandria. It doesn't matter. I mean, all the way up to Jerome giving his introduction to the Vulgate. Every single idea that we find from the 2nd century forward that talks about Mark's gospel has it connected to something Peter did, Peter said. And so why would Mark be the first utilized? I actually think there was an earlier gospel that was circulating before Mark, but it wasn't in Greek. That's another discussion for another time. But Mark is the first one that was circulating in the Roman Empire, and it was given its priority because of Petrine priority. And so if it is indeed the testimony or the memoirs of Peter, so to speak, and even Justin Martyr insinuates this even in his discussion about quoting what seems to be Mark's gospel in relation to the sons of Zebedee, he talks about it in the sense of the memoirs of Peter. And if these are the memoirs and the teachings of Peter, he is in the inner circle of the three. He is the one that was told that Christ would build his church on, him being the name Petros or Kephas in Aramaic. And so he is the rock. And so if he is going to be the Petrine image and leader of the apostles, as we see him play out in the book of Acts, as we see Paul give that sea of honor to, even in his conversion stories, whether they're talking about Galatians 1 or you're talking about his statements about him in 1 Corinthians. It seems to be that Peter had always had some sort of primacy to the other apostles, and his testimony carried great weight. So in my perspective, we have to start with not just like who's depending on who is utilizing who. The question is why. Now, some would say it is a practical side of the type of writing. Mark is a very concise, a very not necessarily neat, but kind of a messy way of telling the story of Jesus, kind of just out there, doesn't have good transitions and stuff, which again argues our point in the historical approach of the Gospels, that this was a oral tradition of Peter that was turned into a written tradition. And there's places in that that demonstrate that. There's long sections of, if you're looking at it in the Greek text of Mark, where the writing is bad because you have a pronoun and without antecedents. I mean, because you got to go back 2 and 3 chapters in our English translations to go back. And meanwhile, the ESV, the NIV, and the CSB are putting, instead of he, him, his, he, him, his, is going Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. But in the Greek text, you have long periods of time without any representation of the actual noun going back to Jesus's personal name, but rather just continues he, him, his, and his. And it could be because that was a massive section of Peter's sermon where there wasn't need of clarity of who he was referring to in one scene. There's a lot of ways to argue this. And so the question to me, Stephen, goes back to why is Mark the priority? Why is Matthew and Luke feeling like they have to be somewhat dependent, at least for a gauge, even if they correct the chronology, the timing, the listing, the names, the details, or adding or subtracting? Why is Mark the template to begin with? Well, from the historical argument, which is mine, it's because it is a Petrine primacy here. There is a Petrine honor that is going into even the Gospels. Each one of the Gospels, if you look at who out of the 12 is the most noted, quoted, and described of the apostles, it's Peter in all 4, especially Mark. So Peter's the inside view and the outside view.
But if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark,
yes,
and some other sources, and that they favored Mark as the gospel that they used as the backbone of their own rewriting, as opposed to using some other source, like that was their religious text. That was the one that they were favoring.
I think that they were showing Petrine honor, and they were giving Mark its proper place. And by doing that, they were working off of that template. I think Mark was their template. All of the other things may have had independent insight to it. This is what makes John so unique. John doesn't feel like, and I do believe John is very much aware of Mark's gospel. Dr. Goodacre and I have had a good discussion about this. I do believe that John, but he doesn't follow the template. He does his own template. He recreates the whole system and chronology, wanting to make sure, like at the wedding of Cana, this is the first time Jesus glorified himself through a miracle. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing that. Then he tells you this is the second time. He has a different chronology. He starts earlier than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yeah. He wants to go back to a different idea. He is not dependent, though he is aware, he is not dependent on it the same way that Matthew and Luke are. Now, let's think about why that's the case, Stephen, because if Matthew, I believe Matthew is a group gospel. I think that the initial creation of it was actually in a different form. I think what we have today in the Greek Matthew was a publication from either Antioch or Jerusalem. I personally think it was from Jerusalem that was meant to be sent to the churches. And it was a collaborated work between various eyewitnesses and authorities in the Church of Jerusalem that was sent out during that time period. And so Matthew's gospel is unique in that it is from the headquarters, because at that point, the headquarters in the mother church was particularly Jerusalem. So I think it is the mother of it, if you would, but it would also need the Petrine influence as well. And that's what it does. But it also makes itself very appealing to Jewish converts. But Matthew, in that sense, is necessitated based on where do we start the narrative of Jesus that's going to go into the entire Greek speaking world? How do we do that? Well, you start with Mark, and then you have all of these other individuals that may have been around that were working and putting together a gospel. Luke is telling us that he has investigated this thing. He is telling us that he had gotten it from the eyewitnesses, but there's no doubt that one of those eyewitnesses he would have been utilizing is Mark. Not Mark as the eyewitness, but Peter telling it that Mark is writing as the eyewitness. Yeah. And so he's using anybody that he gets into contact with. I mean, we see stories of individuals that are not in any of the Gospels. We're talking about Cleopas on the road of Emmaus later on. I mean, he tells stories of patrons of those like Joanna and a collective with Mary Magdalene. He's the only one that tells us she was possessed with 7 demons, but he mentions that these women were actually patrons. Why? Because he seems to be a fan of that. I mean, he seems to have one in Theophilus. So Luke's going to take a different approach, but he is still going to use the Petrine template in order to tell the story to the Greeks, which is that Jesus is the savior of humanity going back to Adam, as opposed to Matthew going to Abraham and David being the Davidic figure. And then he's going to go through the stories like the superhero of proper morality and conduct of the law is not a Jew. It's a Samaritan or a Greek or something like that. So he's going to show that Jesus is the savior of the outsider, the publican, the outcast, the harlot, the demon possessed, the Samaritan. I mean, Luke's doing that because his gospel is meant to be more of an evangelical approach to spreading the gospel for the first time. Yeah. Seems to be with Paul's ministry. So that would make perfect sense. But they seem to have that same template going back to the Petrine language in Mark.
Okay, well,
my perspective.
So we got somebody said it was a good slide, fair take. I don't want to have this slide up for too long. I think it's motivating me to push through, but I just wanted to mention the disagreements between McClatchy and Dan before I get rid of this slide was that, you know, the undesigned coincidences suggest access to facts, not just underlying tradition, but true underlying tradition, right? That explanations from some kind of a lost text or source text, which we've just established, you know, you believe that those existed, that appealing to them to explain away undesigned coincidences is ad hoc, unsupported, implausible, yes. And that redaction does not explain arbitrary discrepancies, that the parallels that McClatchy says, for example, the green grass, that this is an allusion to Psalm 23, that does not mean inherently that it's fabricated. And McClatchy famously says that this could mean that Jesus was simply performing acts that fulfilled his messianic role, and that then they end up being documented that way, right? It's not necessarily a literary fabrication. And that McGrew, he clarified, does not actually reject scholarship. She just brackets it for method. So he points out that, you know, Dan says that in her book, she specifically says that she's not going to address the scholarly concerns against undesigned coincidences. And in McClatchy adds some clarity that what McGrew is doing there is simply like setting that discussion aside because it's something she addressed in another book, and that independence is graduated and not all or nothing. Now, Eric Manning put out a video that I'm also going to link in the slideshow for everybody who's on Cross Bible Patreon. But he is basically recapitulating what Lydia McGrew wrote in a blog post regarding the text dismissal of undesigned coincidences or theory that this explains undesigned coincidences, that there's an underlying source that's now lost. That was the focus of Eric Manning's video on the Testify channel. So oral and literary tradition theory is too elastic, right? Like he's basically channeling Lydia McGrew here, right? So that there are no manuscript or patristic evidence for an text, that it's ad hoc, it violates Occam's razor. And the appeal to Occam's razor is really just like, you're either dealing with an text or you're dealing with undesigned coincidences. Like it's kind of black and white. Whereas I think, you know, there's some difference between Eric's characterization and Lydia's characterization of what the text really is, because it's a question of, was there like a single authoritative text that had all of these details that you're appealing to? Or is there just variegated like oral tradition and some texts and things that you're appealing to to explain away undesigned coincidences, right? So in the Bethsaida episode, that Matthew preserves the woes and Luke preserves the feeding location and Mark preserves the related miracle, and that these are the interlocking details that the undesigned coincidence theory is built on. For Philip, John highlights Philip and Luke locates the feeding at Philip's hometown. So those are interlocking details. The Passover timing. So John gives dates, Mark gives the day-by-day sequence, and together they naturally align. Yep. And then literary explanations like the green grass in Psalm 23 are overinterpreted, unfalsifiable, and capable of explaining any detail and thus explaining nothing. And in particular, he says that, look, if it were to say that the grass were brown, you would simply find another piece of scripture, another Old Testament passage that talks about, a desolate wasteland. And you could say that, oh, must be what Mark is doing, right? That you could sort of invoke any explanation to explain that. And then Lydia, her article, I don't think she's put out anything specifically responding to Dan at this point. But what Eric was appealing to was her article that, in summary, it targets speculative and unfalsifiable source appeals. So basically, like, you need an explanation. Oh, it must be an or text. It must be a lost, now lost source, right? It doesn't target ordinary tradition. It's ad hoc. There's no manuscripts that support it. I don't recall if Lydia is, I think she grants that there may have been a Q, there may have been a Hebrew Matthew, but we can't necessarily reach for it whenever we want to get out of a situation or explain away an undesigned coincidence. And she gives this interesting reductio ad absurdum argument based on the Gettysburg Address, to just basically say that, like, appealing to these non-existent sources just kill, they're history killers, right? Like, they sort of degrade the historical method in general if you're applying the historical method to the study of the Bible. So, but to clarify, and I think this is something that Eric didn't necessarily align with Lydia on. Lydia does not posit a single massive comprehensive or text, right? She acknowledges that people who are using this argument are postulating different kinds of or texts and underlying traditions. And she does not posit that scholars explicitly endorse such a source, right? She's pretty fair about what she's actually arguing against. And predicts instead that there will be that people will appeal to vague, localized sources and isolated cases. And that eyewitness testimony fits better because witnesses recall different details without explaining the links, right?
Yep.
Copying a unified source would preserve causes plus explanations, and that the undesigned coincidences that link Acts and Paul, if you appeal to an or text for those, the hidden sources behind Acts and the epistles or skepticism, Paul himself, she argues in this blog post that is linked under the slide, that just falls apart. And I think that's pretty much, that's the lay of the land in terms of, like, what everybody's arguing about at this particular junction.
Yeah. And I know all of these individuals, and, Eric and I have done on his channel and my channel together, discussions about individual situations like this. I think that he makes really good points that need contextualizing that Lydia does not. And McClellan, sometimes, Dan's a good guy. I mean, I don't think that everything he said is completely wrong. I think that what he has done has raised the alarm to the overstating and the overkill of this situation. The concern I have with him is the waving of the hand. The waving in the hand of some of these things and I know that, it kind of shifted gears to scholarship and what is and isn't scholarship. Yeah. And that just took us off the tracks and the whole train went off. But I do think that at some point we're going to have to stop that kind of conversation and actually have real conversations. We're actually going to have to sit down like adults, and we're going to have to look at the data when it is put out, and it is going to be peer reviewed, and we're going to not be able to use that language anymore. We're going to have to sit down and work back through these stories like the feeding the 5,000 or some of these narratives around the crucifixion, or looking at it from Acts and Paul's writings, because McClatchy spends most of his time there. I mean, and that's the things like McGrew wants to spend a lot of time, particularly in the Gospels, although she does cover things in Acts and the Apostles or the Acts and the Apostle Paul. But, McClatchy likes to spend a lot of time, particularly on that aspect, on looking at Acts in relation to the Pauline letters. So each one is emphasizing different things. And I think that at some point we're going to have some fun discussions about this. But this is a good opportunity for us to start peeling it back and saying, all right, where are we going too far here? Mm-hmm. Is there something to this? Is there an overstated case, an understated case? I think it'll be fun to kind of go through some of these examples and just kind of get a sneak peek of what we're going to see as we move forward in the future.
Well, what concerns me is the fact that because sort of mainstream scholarship hasn't yet attempted to address some of these, the undesigned coincidences, because it's not quite on the radar yet.
Right.
And because in 2020, and this was a lot of, I was colluding with Derek Lambert on a lot of this stuff back when I was kind of like sending him this information, and he was covering it on Myth Vision podcast, and I think he was orchestrating a lot of the blog posts that Richard Carrier put out. And I think that one of the response, the response from Eric recently was to say that, Dan McClellan is basically making the same argument as Richard Carrier. And it really felt like poisoning the well, because Richard Carrier just happens to be one of the only people who has actually addressed this. And so it concerns me that when anybody expresses legitimate concern over over undesigned coincidences, they get grouped in with Richard Carrier. It's like, you're using Richard Carrier's argument, and then that seems very fallacious to me. I think you should be able to object to undesigned coincidences on those grounds without being tainted by association with people who have a bunch of other extreme views that you don't agree with,
or ignored because your associations are smaller.
Yeah, exactly. And also the concern I have is that because of the sort of tendency towards tribalism, that basically what we're going to end up in, we were in the situation in 2020 when this first started, and now I think in 2025 it's even more prominent, is that everybody online is basically feels pressure to align on one side of this issue. And that basically, if I personally end up siding with Dan McClellan, then all of a sudden I am cast as you're a Richard Carrier fan, right? You're an unbeliever. And I don't believe that undesigned coincidences have risen to the level of needing to be an article of faith in order to be a card-carrying member of the Christian club online, right? I think you can be a Christian and you can believe in the Bible and the Gospels, and you can believe in the historical reliability of the Gospels, and not find undesigned coincidences to be convincing, right? I think but I think the tendency online is not that you have to pick a side now, and it's if you're on Dan's side, that necessarily means that then you're an atheist, right? Then you're just not, then get out of the then get out of the church. And I just don't think it should be that extreme. I think this is just one of the many options on the menu of how to approach, alignment and misalignment and sort of puzzles and tensions within the gospel traditions and Acts and the epistles. It's one of the available solutions out there. It's not necessarily something that you have to get behind, or else you're just not, you don't have enough faith. I don't know.
Yeah. And let me say, these kinds of things were argued before this terminology of undesigned coincidences. They just weren't called that. Yeah. And they weren't collected in a whole database where it's here's 40 examples in Acts or something like that. There were already defenses of these passages that are very similar to what's being argued from the undesigned coincidence crowd. They just weren't given that title yet. So they already existed in the past. It's not for the first time ever, we have an undesigned coincidence argument. By that terminology, yes. By the actual methodology of arguing for its validity, no. This has been going on. That's why Wes referenced others, and you even had it on the screen all the way back to Lightfoot and others, in the past. I mean, it's not a new concept. The terminology is just now getting more traction.
So walk us through, I don't know if I should be doing it or if you should be doing it, but like, I think the narratives here, it's probably for people who aren't like reading the screen. I should probably narrate. So Mark 6:30 through 34. If we all assume Mark in priority and that this is this is the scaffolding that the other gospels are built on, and it's potentially the Petrine tradition, right? Starting in verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. That is the New Revised Standard Updated Edition, by the way. So the key components here that are being honed in on for the purpose of undesigned coincidences is that in Mark, the apostles return from the mission and they report their work. Jesus initiates a withdrawal to a deserted place explicitly so that they may rest, because constant crowds have left them with no leisure to eat. And despite this, the crowds run ahead on foot and arrive first. And Jesus responds with compassion and begins to teach. So Mark explains why Jesus withdrew, right? Because of overcrowding, constant demands, physical exhaustion, lack of rest, shared by Jesus and the apostles. This is explicit in Mark 6:31. And this coincides with Matthew in interesting ways. Based on the initial verse 12, his disciples came and took the body and buried him. They're talking about John the Baptist. And then they went and told Jesus. So this is what preempts the parallel in Matthew 14:13. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew. So when he hears about John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick, or their illness. And this gets echoed in Luke without the element of teaching, right? On the return, this is Luke 9:10 through 11. On their return, the apostles told Jesus all they had done. Then taking them along, he slipped quietly into a city called Bethsaida. When the crowds found out about it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed to be cured. So we have Jesus in Matthew withdrawing by boat to a deserted place after hearing the news of the execution of John the Baptist. The crowds followed him on foot from the towns. Jesus responds with compassion and heals the sick. And in Luke, Jesus withdraws to a location that is specifically identified as Bethsaida or Bethsaida. And then the crowds discover this and follow, and Jesus welcomes them and teaches about the kingdom of God, and he heals again without the teaching motif. Give us a little more deep depth in this perspective on this.
So again, when I look at these things from the historical perspective, if Matthew is taking the perspective of a group that was a part of the ministry of Jesus and continued his tradition in Jerusalem, I'm going to look at it from one perspective. If I'm looking at it from Peter's perspective in Mark 6, which, by the way, in this situation, Mark has the longer of the storytelling here, which is not always the case. Usually he's actually in the shorter side of storytelling. Luke is even less involved in this situation, more so just by telling one single perspective, which I'm going to get into his in a minute, because he uses the idea here differently than, say, Mark. And we'll talk about Luke last. Let's just focus on Matthew's perspective. One of the techniques that I show my students all the time is when we're in Matthew's gospel, he likes to use compression. Compression is taking multiple concepts and you're literally compressing it into a smaller section and a smaller narrative. What that'll do is that'll skip things and it'll make three events look like one event. We see this in a lot of the Greek writings, especially during that Homerian and beyond period, especially when storytelling comes into play and different legends. So Matthew's kind of already setting us up for something a little bit different. If you notice in verse 12 in Matthew's gospel here, you have John the Baptist's body being buried. Now, if you go into the beginning of Luke's section here, we don't have anything relevant to this.
Yeah.
Now, in Mark's gospel, we do have the idea of this taking kind of indicated in place where Jesus is sending out his 12. It doesn't list them at this point, as it does in some other places, but it really gets into Jesus launching his disciples out, giving them power. And then it talks about the death of John the Baptist. It has its own designated section for that. Mark's going to focus on a couple of things here. The entire group of the apostles gathering around, right? Matthew, on the other hand, kind of just moves past all that and just says the disciples came, took the body, buried, and they went and they told Jesus, and Jesus heard and he withdrew. But one of the things that is unique to Matthew here is he comes down into the discussion about Jesus withdrawing himself from there and goes to a deserted place. Now, look again in verse 31 in Mark 6. Come away to a deserted place, all of you by yourselves, and rest a while. For many were coming and going. They had leisure, nothing to even eat. Why is Matthew telling us that or not telling us that where Mark is? Because Mark had just told us that they were sent out to do a lot of things. They were exhausted. They had been ministering all the time. The collective group of the apostles is being highlighted in Mark.
Yeah.
Their exhaustion, their hunger, their lack of sanity, that they had been without sleep. Whereas Matthew's kind of honing in, yeah, he mentions the disciples, but it highlights Jesus particularly. Look at verse 13 in Matthew. Jesus heard this. He withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself.
Yeah.
But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them.
Exactly.
Mark is focusing on the group. Matthew is focusing on Jesus. Now, why is that? Because what we find all through Mark's gospel, and I've got examples of this, when you look at Mark's gospel, you have a lot of reasons to believe Peter is kind of the narrator or the insider's view that goes on here. Because in, say, Mark 10:28, he's speaking on behalf of the group. Like, he's talking for everybody. Then we find in other places like Mark 14, where Jesus addresses the whole group, but he doesn't actually address the whole group. He addresses Peter in place of the whole group. For example, when he's with the three and they all fall asleep while Jesus is saying, watch and pray, it says he found them sleeping, but he said to Peter, Simon, why are you sleeping? For example, like there's many times this happens. I'm giving you one. We also find where both those things are happening, where Peter is speaking for the whole group and Jesus is addressing Peter on behalf of the whole group, all in the same story, like Mark chapter 11. Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed. And Jesus replied to them, have faith in God, while responding specifically to Peter. We also find other places where when Peter's on the scene, details get bigger. Now, all of a sudden, there's extra details, which is what you're seeing here in this passage. When Peter's not on the scene and the apostles are isolated or something like that, it's very matter of fact. But we also see, Mark's gospel, when Peter understands something and the meaning of it, he gets really excited and wants to tell you that. So when he's on the scene, there's also a little bit of interpretation going on. But
do you
Peter
think,
is a,
sorry,
but in Matthew, you don't see that at all. Matthew's not even focused on how the apostles deal with this. They just came and buried the body of John the Baptist. And then they reported the news. It's all about Jesus dealing with this. It's Jesus dealing with his cousin's death. Mark is all about the apostles gathered around Jesus. Yes, they told him. And now it's instructive. The group is being given instruction by Jesus. Come and go to a deserted place. You're tired. You're hungry. You've dealt with this. And then they went away in a boat to a deserted place all by themselves. And so it's a focus. If we can take the historical approach here, Stephen, Matthew is doing what Matthew always does. He compresses the story and only focuses on the highlighted point, which he hasn't built yet. He's building, and that's on Jesus and what he's about to do. This in Mark's gospel is about the apostles.
Yeah.
Yes, Jesus is involved, but it's about their involvement, their way, their exhaustion, their hunger. It's now encompassing the whole group, which is consistent with what we see in the rest of the gospel of Mark. Thoughts there before we go into Luke.
Okay, but from Matthew's perspective, Matthew knows Mark. Matthew knows that that the disciples were fatigued and that this was the reason they went away. But he has a different narrative purpose in making Jesus withdraw himself by himself as soon as he hears about John the Baptist to deal with the death of his cousin. So it seems to me like he is replacing the reason that he knows that the reason in Mark is fatigue and it's involving the disciples. He just has a compelling reason to fit his narrative because he's coming off of the death of John the Baptist to replace, like, I see this as just a replacement. Like this is, there's one reason in Mark and there's a completely different reason in Matthew. And I don't know if the undesigned coincidence lens allows that reading. I think it disqualifies that reading, if I'm not mistaken, like, because Matthew can't have a different reason than Mark.
Well, his reason is different. And the traveling is the difference here. The isolation, as well as going into the scene where Jesus then walks on water, Matthew is going to spend far more time on that event than Mark does. In fact, Matthew gives us more detail to declarations and this idea of Peter, like, call out to me and I'll go to you. And then he sinks. Mark just like, which is really odd because typically it's all about Peter. But in this situation, Matthew wants to focus on Jesus's power over creation, wind, water, physics, this whole idea. Mark just kind of hurries past that point to get to the next scene of Jesus's miracles. So what Matthew is doing in this section is he's compressing the whole narrative to make it a piece to something that he's always trying to emphasize. And what is that he's trying to emphasize? He's trying to emphasize that Jesus is the King of the Jews. He is a descendant of David. He is the promised seed of Abraham. That's the very, very beginning of his gospel. And that he is going to point to a Jewish appeal to get them to see the Messiah through the lens of David and Abraham. And one of the things that we find here in the particular passage as it goes to Matthew 14 is the story of Jesus walking on water. And then he quickly goes through the sick that is on the other side, quickly covers it and goes straight to the traditions of the Jewish leaders. Mark doesn't spend as much time on that. He focuses more on everything that Matthew highlights, Mark doesn't, and vice versa. Like they swap on their emphasis here. So when we're talking about this passage from like an undesigned coincidence, is Matthew depending on Mark? It seems to be the case, but their agendas are not the same. They are telling the same narratives, and they're actually telling about the different isolated conducts of going to deserted places, except one's focusing on Jesus, one's focusing on the whole group. So where is your problem? I guess like my question is like, where's your problem with the undesigned coincidence?
I guess, well, okay, but my understanding of the undesigned coincidence hypothesis is that Luke's anchoring this scene in Bethsaida is really that's the anchor for the undesigned coincidence, right?
Yes.
And why is that? Can you explain that?
Well, hold on. So go back to your problem before we get to Luke, because I want to get to Luke because Luke's one that's going to actually be a helpful piece here. Where is your concern with the Matthew and Mark disconnect of the undesigned? Just if we have those two gospels, just those two gospels. What is your concern?
I mean, it's not a concern. It's just my reading of this is that Mark has a reason why Jesus withdrew collectively with his disciples.
Agreed.
And that Matthew is casting that aside, or at least the motivation, and he wants the motivation to be specific on Jesus and John the Baptist, and he is overriding his source in this particular aspect. And I don't know if, maybe if, if you can represent, the undesigned coincidence perspective here, is that reading admissible? That's fine. That's fine. Is there a problem with that?
So what you're going to find is I'm a middle person on most of these arguments. Like I think there's an overstated case and there's an understated case. I'm not looking on every line for an undesigned coincidence. I'm looking at the entire narrative itself. Where we have distinction, there's distinction that's consistent with the writer's tendencies throughout, which is historically, I'm looking at it. You understand my position. My position is to look at this historically. We have transmitted statements about how and why these gospels came to us and from where they came. If those things are true, I have spent my whole scholastic life trying to test the weight of those things. If Matthew is writing to this group with this agenda, with this purpose, and he seems to be borrowing statistically from Mark, how do I reconcile the tension from those two things? Because there is going to be undesigned coincidences if Matthew is taking one insider's perspective, Mark is taking another insider's perspective, and they're telling the same story. But you do have independent concepts that are in each other, that are separate from each other, while also depending on each other's template. If Matthew's depending on the template of Mark, but there are independent things, independent ideas that are not mentioned by Mark or vice versa, then there has to be some room for what is being argued on the other side, undesigned coincidences of the events that are filling out the story from each other, which is what you were just introducing in Luke, coming into the subject of the city of Bethesda. Now, my point is, I don't think we have to run to an undesigned coincidence yet. I don't think we don't have to. I think there's room for it, especially in Mark here. But my goal is, do we see consistent historic independence? Does Matthew do anything independent of Mark as of yet? Up to this point, I would say that Matthew is simply compressing Mark. But would you say that anything, like from your perspective of reading Matthew, do you see anything of independence from Mark? Or is it all just more of a condensed version or a compressed version of Mark?
Yeah, I think the John the Baptist motivation is independent from Mark.
Yes.
I don't think he's getting that from Mark.
No, I don't either. Even though Mark does mention the perspective of, obviously, John was killed.
Yeah.
So can you see why maybe just on John the Baptist, and I like that we're working through this because this is, like for the audience, we didn't like hash this out. We're just literally talking.
We just met.
So
Bethsaida is considered a remote location. Is that what, like, I'm still having trouble identifying.
That's where they're going to go. That's where they're going to go with this next. They're going to go with that next. So McGrew or Jonathan is going to go that direction next. But can there be the concept of an undesigned coincidence just off John the Baptist before we even get to Bethesda?
I just don't. I mean, it's the idea that it's undesigned is based on the idea that it's not something that could have naturally arose from Matthew simply trying to get in the headspace of Jesus. It's like, Matthew reads Mark, he sees them withdrawing. He's more interested in what's going on in Jesus's head, and he narrates that for us. I just don't see the need to appeal to an undesigned coincidence to explain what Matthew's doing there. I think there are stronger.
And that we agree. On that we agree. But we got to remember, there's 4 accounts here too. So that's where this gets. That's where this is. I think I asked you the question. It wasn't a trick. I'm sorry if it sounded like one. I asked you the question about Matthew and Mark without Luke, or even appealing to the feeding in John, because if we only have Matthew and Mark, here's my view: an undesigned coincidence isn't necessary.
I agree.
Okay. All right. So we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
Now, my friend, and listen, I'm not speaking for Wes. I'm not speaking for Jonathan. I'm not speaking for Eric or Lydia or anybody else. Again, I'm friends with these people. I've been on their channels, but I'm asking questions for clarity to say, this builds the argument. What necessitates an undesigned coincidence? I don't think with Matthew, Mark only, we even have the need for one. And I don't think it's required. So now comes Luke. All right, so carry on in Luke.
Okay, so carrying on. Well, I guess we're still in a synoptic parallel. So rather than read the scripture, I will just say that for Mark, it as it grows late. This is Mark 6:35 through 38. Right as it grows late, the disciples urge Jesus to dismiss the crowd so they can buy food in surrounding villages to feed all these people. Right, and Jesus responds, "You give them something to eat." The disciples object with a concrete economic calculation that it's 200 denarii is what it's going to cost, specifically in Mark. And Jesus then asks how much food they have, and they discover 5 loaves and 2 fish. Moving on to Matthew, as the evening comes, the disciples make the same request. Jesus responds with the same command. The disciples reply simply, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And then the denarii calculation and the investigative command to go and see are omitted from Matthew. Then Luke comes along, and as the day draws to a close, the 12 ask Jesus to dismiss the crowd so they can lodge and obtain provisions, and Jesus responds with the same command. The disciples reply, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish unless we are to go and buy food for all of these people." So the undesigned coincidence proponent would argue that Mark preserves vivid concrete details. He has the lateness of the hour, the economic objection, the 200 denarii, Jesus's directive to inventory available food. Then Matthew abbreviates the exchange, retaining the core dialogue, but omitting that economic detail. And then Luke includes the conditional objection, "unless we are to go and buy food," which allegedly presupposes Mark's economic concern without reproducing it. So this is how,
you did that well. Good job.
Well, I'm reading my notes, and again, all these notes will be available. Anybody who signs up on Patreon, I'm gonna clean this all up and put it up there in the next couple of days. Please by the way, if you haven't liked already, and subscribe to Cross Bible. Go subscribe to Facts with Stephen Boyce. I'll make sure there's a link in the chat for that as well. And on the 30th, I am dropping a new video that's going to be my travel vlog for SBL, my SBL recap and my vlog of my adventures in Boston. So stay tuned for that, because I'm hoping that's going to be I put a lot of work into that video.
So going back to the Mark situation, the proponents of the undesigned coincidences are going to focus on everything you just said right there in the middle, and that you have explicit details, which again shows the consistency of Mark's gospel, that there is a narrator from an insider's view that remembers explicit things, the feel of the time of day, the amount, the discussion, the instructions, the provisions. All of that is being placed in front of us. Matthew, once again, compresses the whole thing, because that's what Matthew does. So I, again, don't see the problem here where you need undesigned coincidence. It's Luke that comes in that now creates the dialogue for undesigned coincidence. You could argue in this section that it is necessitated through Matthew and Mark just on the details, but Luke comes into play here and now kind of validates the necessity of this discussion.
I think Luke is just jiving with Matthew here. He just he knows that Matthew cut out those details, and he's fine to keep those details out of his narrative. He's not restoring Mark.
No, he doesn't feel like he needs to. But the question is why? Why does Luke feel like he doesn't need to come in behind this? And again, look at the chronology, right? You were talking about if you go back your previous slide, you had mentioned chronology issue here too. Or was that on Dan's slide? You talked about the chronology.
The chronology on Dan's slide was that Mark places Bethsaida after the feeding, and Luke places the feeding at Bethsaida in 9:10. That was it.
Yes. So go back to the first right there. Thank you, please. Yes. Thank you. All right. Sorry, we're covering a lot here, and I can't remember your numbers of slides. Look at Luke, because I said I wanted to agree on Matthew and Mark, which we did. So now let's come over to Luke. The timing of this is odd. Matthew seems to not care.
No.
He has no point of reference at all. He's just like, let's compress this thing. Let's get to the main point I want to get to. Luke wants us to know that Jesus slipped quietly into the city and names it, right?
Yeah.
So that's problematic on the timing because Mark and Luke don't agree on the timing. Now, I do this all the time, and I want your thoughts on this, Stephen, because when I teach my students on the gospel reliabilities, one of the things I point out constantly is Papias' of Hierapolis' statement of Mark, and that he did write down the sermons or the teachings of Peter, but not in a particular order. Whereas he argues for the fact that Matthew does put the teachings in the Logia in a particular order. Now, Luke tells you from the very, very beginning, like, I have written to you an orderly account. Like, it is right there in the very beginning. And I usually use the cursing of the fig tree story, which hasn't happened yet. It will after this narration. The timing of the tree being cursed, for example, one is on the way to and one is on the way from. And it's like, well, how do you reconcile this? I usually have these Christian evangelicals in a class, and they're sitting there like brainstorming as how they can reconcile differences like this. And I end up reading through the whole narration through the concept of Papias told us pretty early on that Mark's gospel was not even in order anyway. It was just a collection of Peter's sermons, and Peter wasn't entirely concerned about the accuracy of timing. John is very much. Luke says, I got it right, I got it perfect. Mark doesn't care. So right off the beginning of this, the timing of this that was brought up on the first slide from going back to Dan, how do we explain the timing problem here? Well, Mark's not interested in timing at all. He's interested in telling you what happened from an insider's perspective. Like, you got to see what happened. This is what Jesus did this happened. He's just quickly giving you the facts. And then he moves on. Whether it happened in that order or not, don't care. Luke is very precise. Now, why does Luke come in here? And if you would kindly correct Mark, remember what he said at the very beginning. I have written to you an orderly account that he had studied very diligent to put together that account in an orderly fashion.
Yeah.
Why does Luke seem to need to put the context with the timing and the location of Jesus's escape? Because he is not interested in the details like Mark gives, and he doesn't feel like he needs to repeat them. He's interested in getting the chronology and to make the point, which you find in red at the bottom of the screen here. Notice what Luke does here in the end of this. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God. Now, let me ask you this question. Do any of these other writings mention the idea about speaking to them about the kingdom of God? Now, it does say, if you look at it, it does talk about the idea of teaching. There is a concept of here Jesus doing some sort of interacting.
Yeah.
Why does Luke focus particularly on that line right there about the kingdom of God and healed those who need to be cured? Now, Matthew does say there was a curing of the sick, but Matthew doesn't mention what Luke just said. And again, Stephen, I'm going to keep beating this dead horse. From a historical perspective, Luke is writing to a group of outcasts, non-Jews, people that are paganized and so forth. And I would think he's sympathetic to that because we learned that Luke himself was not a Jew. He was Antiochian, according to historical data. So if he's an Antiochian, he's an outsider, and he's sharing the fact that the gospel was given to the outside. The kingdom of God is bigger than the Jews, which Matthew wants to make sure that you know the kingdom of heaven, a very Ezra and Nehemiah language, has come to the Jews. He's focusing on how that kingdom impacts the Jewish people. Luke is focusing on how it affects the world, humanity, the outside. Yeah. He now comes in, and if he is the great, physician that history says he is, if he is the Luke, the beloved physician that Paul speaks of, what is he going to focus on? What is going to be the meaning and the purpose of this gathering of outsiders from different locations, and Jesus's escape to this place? Chronology's right. And he brings this crowd and he follows them and he starts speaking to them about the grander scheme of the kingdom, which involves what? Healing.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that none of that is expressed in Mark at all. Not one about the healing. Yeah, it says he looked at him as sheep without a shepherd and began to teach them many things. But what things? We have a more precise kingdom theology being taught by Luke, which is consistent with his congregation, and a healing factor, which is consistent with his appeal. And so Luke has already created an extra dynamic that we don't find in Matthew and Mark. So if you kind of go to the next slide, that
Unless
kind of
unless Luke is just acknowledging that Mark has him teaching something, he's explicating that to say he's teaching them about the kingdom of God, and then he's also importing Matthew's like he's basically harmonizing Matthew and Mark.
But Matthew doesn't mention the teaching. He only mentions
so the harmony is he's taking curing from Matthew, he's taking teaching from Mark, he's elaborating on what the teaching was, it's the kingdom of God, and he's healing at the same time. He's doing both in Luke.
But he's able to contextualize location and explicit teaching, which is consistent with his theology. Mm-hmm. So he didn't get that information from Mark. He didn't, not explicitly, not in its exact detail. So either he had to, I know it's a small thing, he either had to make that up and fill in the blank and do some sort of interpolation here, or he got that information from something or someone, and he's able to ground the story both chronologically, where Mark didn't, explicitly fill in the details of the healing and the teaching in a way that Matthew and Mark did not, by giving it what kind of teaching was it? Well, it was about explicitly the kingdom of God, and he heals these people. So they're all, if they're giving us a fuller picture, because there are unique moments or words or details that are not in the other. So either they're making it up or they're getting it from somewhere else. Luke is telling us that his sources are plural. Yeah. The eyewitnesses. He didn't say who, he didn't say which ones, he doesn't say at what locations, but he is saying that his sources
and he doesn't acknowledge that it includes the Gospel of Mark in written form.
He doesn't, but I mean, we could mathematically do the deductions here and say, well, exactly. A good bit of it must have been coming from Mark. So now we're on the second slide here. They all acknowledge that the evening has come to its full end, right?
Yeah.
What ends up happening? Mark, once again, is going to give you an insider's view of the apostles, things they heard, things they saw, things that were told to them. Matthew, once again, seems to bypass that point. Why? He's focusing on the main thing. It's a shorter, compressed story.
Yeah.
Luke, on the other hand, comes in and he wants to deal with the aspect of these provisions. So, all right, we're right. So we're all caught up. Now, where do you want to spend some time? Do you want to look at the Mark side of this? Luke, where's your struggle with what was read off your script from the Undesigned coincidence?
I think on this particular one, the critical evaluation would just be, let's see, on this particular side. So the Undesigned coincidences claim requires redactional explanations are insufficient. Let's see, Mark's...
well, that's because they're shorter. They're shorter than Mark. Luke and Matthew both are shorter than Mark. So what good is redactions here? Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, but we're observing the redaction. It's just what value does the undesigned coincidence bring? Like what is the undesigned coincidence, and what does it explain that the redaction theory we've just been discussing doesn't explain? Where Matthew is abbreviating and then Luke is anchoring, harmonizing. Like the two of us have been discussing redaction theory here. We haven't really brought any undesigned coincidence into this yet.
Right, but now we have to deal with something of independence, right?
Yeah.
Between the three, where would you say that, if you're being charitable to the undesigned coincidence crowd, where do you see the greatest appeal on the screen for that argument? Like, where do they have the most teeth? I would say Mark, but I mean, because of the differences we're about to see, but where's the teeth starting from on the undesigned coincidence from their argument, from the way you understand it?
I don't know.
You don't think so?
No, I just don't know. I don't know. Like just even going through my notes, I'm having trouble identifying like what is what undesigned coincidence are we grasping here?
Well, look at your bold letters. They all agree a statement was made. You give something to eat. Give them something to eat.
Yeah.
The event is the same. So, but the question is, how did it get there? How did the event get there? Matthew and Mark can't be Matthew and Luke cannot be copying Mark.
Why?
On everything.
No, yeah,
we've already established that.
Well, they're rewriting Mark, and they're omitting the detail from Mark. They both know that there was the 200 denarii. They both know about the commandment to go and see. Matthew drops it. Luke drops it.
No, I get that. No, but from your perspective, can you see any point for the argument of the feeding fire? By the way, I'm not a big proponent for this passage. I'm asking questions because I agree with them. I'm asking questions for let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Let's take Dan's argument and criteria. Let's take the one that you had with, say Eric or Jonathan, who's approaching this story. I'm not a proponent for it in every place that they are. I'm asking questions. So if we're at this passage and we're looking at this with everybody's reasoning, everybody's criteria, because remember, you and me are trying to be the fair people where everybody talk to everybody.
No, I want to steel man undesigned coincidences in this passage.
So you decided to highlight the 200 denarii and the go and see in red. What's your breakdown of the red?
The red is the material that both Matthew and Luke have purposefully, that they're aware of, and they've omitted it.
Yep. Okay. And so blue. Walk through blue.
Blue is they all coincide on the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The inventory of food available is consistent across all 3 synoptic gospels.
Yeah, we've got 5 loaves, 2 fish, etc.
Yeah.
Black. You have bold black.
Yes.
At least it looks that way. What is your?
In bold black should have been blue. Really, it's like I guess bold black in the first instance, buy food for themselves, buy something for themselves to eat. Those are coinciding between Matthew and Mark, not Luke. But then you give them something to eat should be blue, because that would go across all 3. Right.
All right. So then we need to ask ourselves, does Matthew have details that are different from Mark that might be important? So if you look at it, there's really not much different other than a compressed view. Send the crowds away. They may go into villages, buy food for themselves. Establish a mark. Jesus said they don't need to go away. Give them something to eat. Establish a mark. Outside of a few word differences there. They replied, there's nothing here but 5 loaves, 2 fishes. Mark gives us a little bit more detail about that. Jesus starts asking more questions. Luke, on the other hand, seems to be in between Matthew and Mark. Same thing. Day's dawning, at a close. 12 came to him and said, send the crowd away so they may go to the surrounding villages, countryside, lodge, get provisions, for we are here in this deserted place. Verse 13 said to them, you give them something to eat. Same thing, consistent. They said, we have no more than 5 loaves, 2 fishes, unless we are to go and buy food for all of these people. Now, the only thing that we can really focus on here in Luke that is nuanced is that line right there.
Yes, exactly.
We have no more than. So whereas, in Mark, it's like, well, when, they went to get, Jesus told him, challenged them. Yeah, well, go see what we got. Scrounge up the scraps. Let's get it together. Matthew just doesn't care. I love Matthew. Sometimes he's just doesn't care. It's look, let's just get to the facts. But it's interesting that Luke takes a different direction that he could not be getting from Mark, and he could not be getting from Matthew. This discussion with the disciples saying, we have no more than, assuming that they were sent to go and see Mark, unless we are to go and buy food for all of these people. Now, people are being quoted. Now, it doesn't say who. People are being quoted here within the inner circle of the disciples saying, well, we do have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but what are we supposed to do with that? Unless we go to the local market and buy food for all of these people.
Yeah.
Do you think that is just simply a redaction? Do you think there is some sort of interpolation here where they're copy paste interpolating? What do you think is happening from Luke's perspective on that last line?
I tend to evaluate this with the assumption that Luke knows Matthew and not that Luke is working off of some Q source. I think
I agree
Luke,
with that.
and I think Luke is basically respecting Matthew here, but he's adding the buy food because he doesn't want to restore the 200 denarii detail, but the proposal of the disciples telling Jesus, like, are we going to go buy food? He sort of subtly restores the information that he got from Mark without copying it, like, but it's still derivative, I think.
But how's he restoring it when Mark doesn't mention that part at all?
Because Mark has the disciples saying, are we to go and buy blank, blank, blank worth of bread? And so Luke has them saying, unless we're going to go and buy food for all these people. So in Mark, there's a number put on it, and Luke is echoing that, but without the detail.
So would you say that Luke has chose at a different location to emphasize the point about the buying for these people in comparison to Mark, like the timing of bringing that up in the conversation?
What do you mean?
So if you look at verse 37 of Mark, for example, give them something to eat. They said to him, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth? It's very calculated, like overly calculated.
Yeah.
They've done like a mathematical equation of like, all right, if it's 75 cents per person, like that, the whole thing,
or it's hyperbole,
worth of bread and give them to eat. Notice the timing of that statement. They said to him, we're going to go buy 200 denarii worth of bread. It's a question. Luke is not a question.
Yes.
It's more of like a, well, what are we going to do unless,
Well, also the calculation in Mark comes before they even went to go check the inventory. Yeah.
That's what I'm getting at. So why would Luke, knowing Mark, we agreed, do that?
I think Luke is recognizing Luke is perceiving a problem in Mark, that they're already running a calculation before they even checked how much they had on hand. And I think Luke is making this make more sense than Mark.
Could it be that when you're looking at it from one side's perspective and the other side's perspective, again, Matthew just seems to be disinterested in this point, just completely disinterested.
Yeah.
Let's get to the main point. That's Matthew. He's doing compression.
Yeah.
Luke, on the other hand, he is not looking at it from an insider's view as much as, like, Mark's very inside. Yeah. Very, very inside. Like preconceived notions, questions that are being answered before they're asked. Luke is trying to like formulate all of this to a final summary in his idea. But I do think this is an intriguing view because Luke must not be dependent only on Mark here. It seems like he has a different conversation in mind. Not in the sense of like timing or in the sense of like the scenario, but in its timing. Mark wants to focus on give them something to eat. The disciples were excuse making, like, my gosh, do you know how much money that's going to cost? Question. Luke's not interested in the questioning as much as the willingness to consider Jesus's request. Mark's not interested in that. They're very turned off to this idea of Jesus. They're not interested in even helping these people. They're just like, look, it's late, it's tired. Do you realize what kind of work it's going to take to make this? Do you know how much money it's going to take to do this?
Yeah.
Luke's considering their willingness, but it could be because Peter, as we've established, if it is Peter and he is speaking on behalf of the whole group, he may have been over speaking for everybody's mindset. the way they felt, the tiredness, the amount of money, knowing what they did or did not have. Luke could actually be focusing on somebody else's perspective. Luke could be focusing more on not the we can't, but the how. Like the willingness to reason with the how. John definitely doesn't focus on Peter's perspective at all here. He comes in and when you're looking at John's telling of a story, like it's all about Philip and it's about Andrew. And there's a lot of connections we can get into in a minute there. So they're clearly not following Peter's line thought process here. But Luke seems to have a different attitude than Mark. And I think that's easily missed even, because I think that if we're looking at the attitude, you can't change the attitude without another perspective, another set of eyes, another set of ears, another set of insight. Matthew doesn't even want to get into the attitude. He skips the attitude, the questioning to the willingness. Luke has more of a, look, this is what we got. It's not a lot, but unless we go to the town and go and get these provisions, like we're not going to be able to fulfill your request, Jesus. Yeah. They've already answered Jesus before he even instructed them in Mark's gospel. It seems to me, my perspective here is that Mark is focusing on Peter's attitude, that he is speaking on behalf of the group. Luke seems to get another nugget of insight that's not Peter's. And that it is not so much of we're questioning Jesus and we're not so much shutting him off before he even tells us what to do with it. He's got the perspective of Luke is an open mind. The perspective of Mark is a non-open mind. Do you see the attitude difference?
Yeah, that I do see.
So is it possible where Matthew doesn't want to deal with the attitude of anybody on the inside? Mark is already turned off to the request before it's asked. Luke is having a willing perspective that it could be that we have a different set of eyes and ears that Luke has investigated to get the fullest sense of what everybody was feeling and thinking in that moment. And that he's not just redacting something.
I just don't know why that's a better explanation than Luke's motivated redaction.
But so then you have to ask yourself, so what would the redaction benefit Luke? By doing
the redaction benefits Luke by eliminating the a priori assumption, making, the a priori assumption that it's going to cost 200 denarii to do this. And then Jesus is like, we'll go check to verify that. He smooths that out. Like Luke has, Jesus saying to them, you give them something to eat. And then they say, oh, well, they actually check. They've checked presumably already. And they said, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we're going to go and buy food. Like, I don't see a problem that I need to resolve here beyond that.
But there would have to be a connecting to do a redaction. There would have to be a following connection. Like, I'm redacting because I need it to fit whatever follows. Otherwise,
he's recapitulating Matthew.
Leave it out.
He's recapitulating Matthew for the most part, except for that last line. So then the question becomes, what was motivating the addition of that last line, right?
Exactly. That's the crux of this. It's obviously a different attitude. The apostles' attitude is different in verses 13 of Luke as opposed to, say, verse 37 or 36, 37 in Mark. So if it's a redaction, and maybe it is, if it's a redaction, it's going to change the text, attitude, scenery, if you would, for the purpose of something that's about to follow. And so for it to be a redaction, we have to come up with some plausible explanations why Luke felt like it was necessary to change the attitude of the apostles from a question to a willing statement. And that would have to be in conjunction with something that follows in the story.
Well, it's a rhetorical question.
It is. So
I think it's kind of natural to turn that into a statement because rhetorical questions kind of are statements.
Yes, but I would. Okay, well, are you going to go to the next slide? We'll build in.
I think the next slide
Yeah,
is more
we'll build
informative.
in. We'll build
because
in
this was all leading up to this next slide,
Yeah.
because this is the anchor of the undesigned
Well, I'm
coincidence.
asking insignificant, stupid stuff, and I'm sorry to
No,
your
it's
audience.
good. I love it. I love digging deep like that. I just
because I want us to get into the mind of the writers before we even get to the climax. Because if we can say, like, maybe there's a hint of this going on, maybe I can see a glimpse. When the big stuff comes, we can already have prepared our hearts for this.
Yes. So the argument for undesigned coincidences focuses on the execution of this feeding miracle itself.
Yes.
So in Mark 6:39 through 44, Jesus orders the people to sit on the
Green
fresh grass, or on the green grass. It's epito chloro horto. Arranging them in groups of hundreds and fifties, he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looks up to heaven, blesses and breaks them, and distributes them through the disciples. All eat and are satisfied. 12 baskets of leftovers are gathered. The number of those fed is specified as 5,000 men. In Matthew, Jesus instructs the disciples to bring the food to him, orders the crowds to sit on the grass, no color, blesses and breaks the loaves and distributes them through the disciples. All eat and are satisfied, and 12 baskets remain. Matthew uniquely adds that the 5,000 men counted were besides women and children, so he indicates that there may be more. And Luke reports that there were about 5,000 men, and that Jesus instructed the disciples to seat the crowd in groups of about 50. He narrates the full miracle sequence. The seating is carried out. The food is blessed and broken, and it is distributed throughout the disciples. Through the disciples, all eat and are satisfied, and the 12 baskets of leftovers are gathered.
All right, where do you want to start?
So I would start. I mean, my main confusion here. So the dispute has focused so far on the idea that because we have, going back to, they were like sheep without a shepherd, right? In verse 34, that by the time you get to green grass, Dan McClellan's point was that this is an allusion to Psalm 23. The problem with that is that Psalm 23 in the Septuagint, that I believe was probably more likely to be the wording that Mark was.
Absolutely.
It says a verdant place, istopon chlois. And chloi, this word here, is the word for grass that doesn't actually specify any state of the grass. Whereas in the Hebrew Masoretic text, it's a bit more specific. So you have to actually presuppose that that Mark was invoking the Masoretic reading.
The Hebrew reading.
Yeah. So that in and of itself is problematic. The other issue that's problematic is that if you actually break down what chloros hortos means, right? Hortos is just grass, and that's what Matthew copies. But chloros, if people are aware of the fact that, for example, the pale mare in the book of Revelation, right? The one that Death is riding on, the horse, that is also a green horse. That's chloros. Because if you look at, BDAG, this is a broad color range. It's not a precise shade.
Yeah, it's not like an exact,
It does not mean vivid or lush or green in the modern sense. So we are actually being misled by the English translation here. When we see the word green, we are thinking of like the green behind me, right? Like it refers to colors between yellow and green. The meaning tends to be shaped by context. So like, if it's talking about grass that's newly bloomed,
trees,
whatever.
Yeah.
So the primary sense is like fresh, living plant life. It's greenish, it's light green, not dried out. I think the problem, so it's commonly used for grass, shoots, branches, chloros hortos, fresh grass. So if the grass is merely fresh, and the implication here, chloros hortos describes it's just not dried. It's not dried out. It's you can sit on it comfortably. If it's not a vivid seasonal marker, because we're not importing our English conception of what green means, and I can looks like these are the sort of ancient Greek color spectrums, and as you can see in the yellow, green, blue spectrum, chloros and chloron and chlun are these two adjectives that tend to be more on the yellow side of the spectrum based on attestation and descriptions. There is a color prasinon, which is modern Greek is prasino, which is our green. There
Yes.
isn't actually a one-to-one correspondence for the color term green the way we conceive of it. And so my concern here is that if we're reading so much into this green grass, and I've highlighted green and red here, from the undesigned coincidences perspective, this is an anchoring, this is in spring, this is an undesigned coincidence because it's right before the Passover, and Mark is giving us an indication of the season. That doesn't explain why Matthew doesn't mention it, like Matthew drops that. And I don't think that we can reach for Psalm 23 because Psalm 23 doesn't even give us a color. So what are we left with? Are we left with just sort of like, Dan McClellan was very specific that according to him, Mark would not say that the grass is green unless he really he believes that he's potentially over-interpreting the word green here. He believes it has significance, that it's being mentioned for a specific reason. And what is that reason? It's Psalm 23. On the other side, on the undesigned coincidence side, they believe it is also being mentioned for a specific reason. And that is because it is indicating that it's a specific point in time, but he's not saying that it's before the Passover. That's the detail we get in John.
I know somebody's already said something to your audience, and I'm going to say it again. You can argue all day that it's not an insider's view, but every time we have Mark, the stories are told from an insider's view. Matthew is not. Yeah. Luke is not. We can argue this and say it's not the case. My simplest explanation, Stephen, is this. If Peter's telling this story, and he is one of the primary people that was involved in this debate of the amounts and the costs and all this stuff, it could just be something he remembered, an insignificant, stupid detail that Matthew doesn't care about, doesn't need, nor does Luke. What do we find? More importantly, when I'm looking at this, what do I find? I find explicit statements made from the inside. The cost of feeding, the questions, the numbers, the details. Like, look, for example, had them sit down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Mm-hmm. Now, look at Luke. He said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each, right? Now, we'll get to that in a minute. But look at the details. Again, when we're talking about Mark, it is shorter than these other gospels. Why is the details fuller? Again, we're getting a disciple's view. It doesn't say which one. It doesn't say, John or James or Peter said to him, like we get in John's gospel. What we have here is the disciples' insider's view. Why is the detail of green matter? It doesn't. It doesn't. But what it does indicate to me is that we do have an eyewitness telling the story. Look, I mean, there's examples of there is no benefit, and typically when we find forgeries, we don't see this kind of meticulous insight detail, especially when others are copying the work and they find it unattractive and unimportant. What I would like to argue here, my opinion, Stephen, is that what we're finding in this section here is what I am more interested in. Was this based on eyewitness testimony? Was it based on somebody who was there, who was involved in the scenery, who saw what happened, heard what happened, and participated in what happened? The indicators that we have built up to this point in Mark's gospel, the interesting, unnecessary details, the numbers, the discussions, the questions, the color that is brought in, whether it's a yellowish color or a green, that middle. I find that this is somebody who is sitting back. I mean, we do this when we tell stories. Oh, I remember this one time I was 12 years old. I was in this gym. It was dimly lit. It was really, really weird. I did this the other day. I'm a high school basketball coach. I was sitting in we were playing a team that they hadn't beat in X amount of years. And I remember telling them a story about my senior year and how I approached going to a visitor's gym an hour before the game. And I remember talking about this one gym. And I remember telling them, I hated that gym. The lighting was always dim.
Yeah.
It was so dim that I had to spend a while getting my eyes adjusted. And the seating was so close to the backboard that fans almost were a couple of steps away from, like, when you're making a layup, you better pump the brakes because you're going to end up in the stands. I remembered weird things like that when I'm telling a story. And that was when I was 17. I'm 30. That was 20 years ago. I'm telling stories to my players about something that happened to me 20 years prior. And I still remembered the tint color of the floor, the closeness and proximity of the bleacher, the dim lights that hung over the rim. And it felt like you were shooting into the abyss. I mean, I remember how hard it was to adjust things because those were big games. One of them was a playoff game that we pulled out at the very end. I remember details, explicit details like that. If I'm telling the story about my brother and his time in the playoffs in there, I'm going to lack a lot of the details that I wasn't there for. I'm just going to go off what I remember learning from him or something like that. To me, when I read Mark here, I get the insider's perspective. We're talking about details that are like unintentional. To me, these are insignificant details, which speaks to the authenticity of the narrator, that he is able to conjure up things that were important to his memory that nobody else who's secondhand coming behind him cares about. This speaks to an eyewitness insider's view. I don't know your thoughts on that.
What do you think? Okay. What do you think of the Psalm 23 appeal?
I think it's unimportant. I don't think it's connected at all. The idea of shepherd is, and I think you did a wonderful job of explaining that, by the way. The color coordination problem is highlighting green, which doesn't fit Psalm 23, as you demonstrated right here in the Septuagint. It doesn't. It
gets translated from the Hebrew as we, lie down in green pastures.
Does, which you're assuming Mark is now working off of a Hebrew text, which is odd. That would be inconsistent with his pattern in other places too. Yeah. So I don't think that's coming from that. Do I think that the sheep without a shepherd concept creates a here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to sit there and go, Dan is an absolute idiot that he even thinks that Psalm 23 is there. The reason I don't think Psalm 20, although it's unique that shepherd and grass is mentioned. But here's the problem with that. We should see other things being painted around the psalmist, because the main point of the psalmist is about going into the shepherd's disposition toward the sheep. I don't want, he makes me lie to green pastures. We see that in provision of bread. I agree with that. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul, leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, right? All of that stuff that goes in there.
Yeah, it's not invoking it beyond that.
It's not invoking it beyond that, to the valley of the shadow of death, not fearing evil, for you're with me, the presence of the shepherd. Because what ends up happening in this passage, they disperse. They go on to the other side. So
Thank you, Katerina Austin, for the super chat, $9.99. I'm just not used to this. There's the first stream where I'm getting some birthday love. Thank you so much. People are welcome to actually write something. I'll read it in the chat. It's very, very nice. Thank you so much. So I don't
see the connection there.
It's not that I don't see the connection, but I don't know how heavily. I think the way that Dan framed this was just saying that, we don't need to reach for an undesigned coincidence because there's a perfectly viable alternative explanation, which is that he's invoking the psalm. But the undesigned coincidence isn't necessarily hanging on the fact that Mark provides this detail. It's the fact that this detail is supposedly a marker in time that basically, if you're familiar with the geography, then you would know that the grass can only be a vibrant green color in the spring, and that is the bridge that they're using to get to John.
And the cost that was mentioned in the previous slide. So let me go back to this. I don't look at undesigned coincidences for the same reason maybe some others do. I look at it from the perspective of, do we or do we not have eyewitness testimony here? And if we do have eyewitness testimony in here, we should see evidence of that. I'm looking at this and saying, we have insignificant, petty, unimportant details that Mark seems to be highlighting, that typically he's the shorter version of everything. He is highlighting here, with the apostles being involved in the discussions, in the questioning, in the instructions to go and see and to collect and the counting and all distribute in the leftover baskets and all the, who's involved? It's the apostles. Why are we getting all these random details unless somebody on the inside is telling their remembrances, their memoirs, their time of telling this story from the insider's view? I personally believe what makes this so important is that what we're getting here, I don't want to say this negatively toward my friends in the undesigned coincidences. If undesigned, and I think they would agree with me, by the way, if undesigned coincidences isn't pointing us to the fact that we have eyewitness testimony, then the undesigned coincidences are just dumb. Because this is why people are going into this with Josephus. They're looking for undesigned coincidences, for example, where he is in the war and telling about the war. Do we see a fluctuation of number of details and undesigned coincidences when he's in and when he's not in the battle? When he's talking about something that happened in the war versus being. I mean, I think it was Josephus that said that he was a actor, or that he was involved in many, but he was an actor as well. Like, he talked about how he was an actor in many of these events. He's a narrator, but he was an actor in many of these things. And what do we expect if somebody is a participant in the event? Details. Unimportant, dumb, insignificant details. When I look at this, whether you want to call it an undesigned coincidence or something like that, what it speaks to me is that we have an insider telling us what happened, and they're doing what we would expect from an authentic storytelling thing. As if you're listening to your grandfather tell stories about the war or something that happened to him, or me telling my players about a basketball game 20 years ago that I still have etched insignificant tones of light color and the positioning of the bleachers and the tint of the floor. And like, I remember those stupid things, but they were important to me because I'm telling it from my vantage point, from my experience. That doesn't happen in Matthew. That doesn't happen in Luke. They don't even think it's important. They skip over that part. Why? Because they weren't there. Or, if you would, I think Matthew is a part of the gospel, but I don't think this part of it is actually from Matthew's eyesight. I think this is a group gospel that is collecting a collection of thoughts and testimonies and publishing it from the headquarters. So that's consistent that they would just, once again, compress, move on. Luke wasn't there. Clearly, again, I don't think Luke's working with Peter. I don't think that's his guy here. And I'm going to tell you why when we get into Luke in a minute. Peter, the only bit of Peter he's getting here is Mark. Everything else is coming from somebody else. And that's where the distinguishes come in. That's why I keep building, like, do you see a difference between the assumption of question versus Mark is insider. So that's what I think about the green grass part. That's my answer to the green grass.
Okay. And then and back to my point, I am not convinced that the grass is actually as green as people are making it out to be. That would narrow the chronological window of, like, the season specifically. I think it probably broadens the season if you take into consideration how the word chloros is actually, like, how broad that color spectrum can be.
It could be like a fading. I mean, it could be in a position of fading.
Yeah. It could be the once you broaden the horizon there, I just don't think there's as much to grasp onto. but it makes sense. I think this has been an oversight, and I just wanted to flag it. Look this up in BDAG if you are want to verify that color is not exactly green.
Well, again, so take my perspective. Does my perspective actually give more validity than, say, the undesigned coincidence or the Psalm 23? Does my perspective have more sensible reasoning behind it than, say, those two explanations?
Your perspective is aligned with the undesigned coincidence, that this is an incidental detail that Mark is including because it's a reliable eyewitness testimony. But the extension to that you don't seem to be reaching for is that it's an anchor in the spring, and that means it's after the Passover, and that we can read another gospel in light of Mark. Like the detail in Mark answers a question raised in another gospel, or vice versa. And you don't seem to feel the need to do that.
I don't think the need is there. And if Mark or if Matthew and Luke are following Mark here, and they're not independent in certain places, although I would argue Luke has some hints of it. I think Matthew is completely dependent on Mark here. I think that those things are insignificant to the fact of, were these stories being told from somebody on the inside? And I think, yes. Are they undesigned coincidences? I think you can make that argument from the collective details in Mark, but ultimately, I don't care what you label it. What I see is somebody on the inside is telling the story, and they're remembering the dumb things that most people don't care about. And that's why Matthew and Luke leave them out.
But when you read John, so we're on John now, and
yes,
you can see that it says, after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. Does a light bulb go off in your head and you say, aha, there's green grass in Mark and Passover
well, Passover's in spring. I
Yes.
I guess you could easily make that argument there. And I think that's probably what everybody else is trying to say on the arguments for the undesigned coincidences. So, but remember, John has a whole different agenda, a whole nother agenda here. He always uses the Paschal feast or one of the feasts, he even mentions, he doesn't use the word Hanukkah, but he does talk about the Feast of Lights. He is always landmarking his stories based on certain feast days, tabernacles, Passover, which Passover of Jesus is mentioned, the first, second. So John's point here is exactly what he's telling you in verse 2. Because he's about to give you a whole new sermon that's not in any of these other gospels. He's about to say the most insane things you've ever heard, like whoever doesn't eat my flesh and drink my blood, can't have life in me, and I can't abide in him, and he in me, and all this other stuff. John has a whole nother reason for telling the story. So we have to keep that in mind.
John? But what do you think of Jesus himself raising the question of where to buy bread here in John, and directing it to Philip? And this is another, undesigned coincidence.
Yes. Point. So now we have names. Thank God. John fills out names in places like we don't know who the disciple is that just whacks people's ears off in the garden, and we find out from John it was Peter. He fills in a lot of details for us, like with the woman who wiped Jesus's feet. Her name will be sent everywhere where the gospel will be sent, and yet Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us who it was. John tells us it was Mary. So John likes to actually fill out way more for us and things. But he has two people in mind, and I don't know why Philip keeps getting picked on. Philip's not the only one that's mentioned here, is he? If we go back to, and I'm going to turn there myself, if you go further into the story of John, Philip's not the only guy that is involved in this narration. You know who the other one is, don't you?
Hold on a second. We're in John 6.
Yeah, obviously Philip is the main guy here. Philip is the main guy. I'm not saying he's not. Now remember what just happened in chapter 5. Okay.
Hold on. I'm going to add cross Bible to the stream because I haven't done that yet.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We got to promote your stuff, right?
That's the idea. And hold on a second. I'm going to log in.
There's another disciple. I don't want to miss him. Oh no, your page expired.
Yeah, it was.
Go to verse 8. I'll just, if you can go to verse 8 for me.
Hold on. So 5-8?
Yes, sir. 6-8, 6-8, 6-8.
6-8. Okay, 6-8. Hold on. It's loading my theme. Let me make sure I get the Greek in there.
This is so consistent with what we see in history about John's gospel and its composition.
All right. Here is 6-8.
All right, we've got another name, don't we?
Yes.
One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, which is how John always introduces him. So that should take us back to chapter 1, where, Andrew's called the first called. He's one of the first called disciples of Jesus. If you're looking at this, he and this anonymous guy who seems to be the disciple Jesus loved are the first ones to follow Jesus. Now, why is that ironic? And I'm trying to pull up my notes on this because I don't think I can. Maybe I can share my screen. Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Let's see if it'll let me.
I'll add it to stage.
I'm going to click add share screen. Let me just share the screen instead.
I don't see it yet. Okay, there we go.
Did it work?
Boom. Got it.
Fantastic. All right, these are my notes for the class I teach. That specifically, this one's on John's class. The Muratorian fragment tells us something very interesting about the Gospel of John. It says the fourth gospel is that of John, one of the disciples, when his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him. Now, what we learned from both the Anti-Marcionite prologue, the Muratorian fragment, and later Clement of Alexandria is that John's gospel was not a single act of one man. It was a group. And I make a major defense of this. Fast you now with me for the space of 3 days. Let us recount to each other whatever has been revealed to us. On the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should narrate the things in his own name as they, plural, called them to mind. So this is a group gospel. John is a group gospel. And this is why I think we see the plural, we, us, and our. We beheld his glory. What's interesting about the Petrine gospel narrative, Mark, is that everybody else up to this point has kind of followed Peter's lead. All of a sudden, John kind of goes into this friendly competition with Mark. And when you go to Mark's gospel, you see the first two names of apostles mentioned is Simon and his brother Andrew were fishing. You then go to John's gospel, and it is flipped. You find out in John chapter 1 that it was Andrew who introduced his brother Peter, but you'll notice the order. Now I'm getting somewhere. Don't lose me here.
Okay.
All right. So sorry, that knocked over my own thing here. If you go to chapter 4 or 1 verse 40, one of the two who heard John speak the following was Jesus, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Same thing you just had on the screen.
Yeah.
Reverse from Mark, Simon, Andrews, or his brother Andrew. Now they're swapped, right? Okay. Now we come into this introduction of Andrew, and the Muratorian fragment is telling us that Andrew was actually the one who motivated the Gospel of John to be written to begin with. Like, John, you should be the narrator, and we'll recollect things as we call them to mind. So it seems to be like, hey, as the group tells the gospel, we're going to tell it, and John, you just narrate. And that seems to be the case. You see these people like vouching for John at the very end of the gospel, like, we know his testimony is true, right? Well, who is this? Like, the narrator steps in and clarifies for a minute, and then they go back out. So here's the thing. In that same chapter, in chapter 1, what ends up happening? Simon is not even speaking. Peter has no voice in chapter 1. In fact, if you go to verse 41, he first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means the Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is Petros. And so what ends up happening here? Peter has no voice. Zilch, says nothing. Jesus says something to him. Andrew says something to him. Peter says nothing. No voice. In Mark's gospel, Peter is the one talking. Andrew has no voice. Well, now another apostle gets introduced in chapter 1, down in verse 43. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We found him," etc., etc. What two apostles are now in the discussion near hometown? Remember, Luke kind of gives us a hint at where this is, didn't he?
Yeah.
Remember the Luke detail? So maybe Luke has insight from somebody else here. Because why did Luke give us the timeline, the template, the location that Matthew just doesn't seem to care about at all? Even Mark doesn't necessarily go into the details of. But we find a common factor between Luke and John here. For the first time, we actually find Luke and John on the same page.
Yeah.
Now, what's so special about this town? What's so special about this place in John's gospel? And what's so special about the people that are explicitly named? John doesn't name himself or say the sons of Zebedee or anything like that. He mentions two. He mentions Andrew and he mentions Philip. I found it interesting between the dialogue of Dan and all this is going on. Everybody left Andrew out. Like, it wasn't just about Philip. It was about Philip and Andrew here.
Yeah. Andrew and
And
Peter.
where they're from that John had already established prior in chapter number 1. That these are some of the first disciples. All right, so let's keep all that in mind. And the Muratorian fragment is telling us that the Gospel of John was going to be told from an insider's view of people, not a person, multiple people that were surrounding the situation. And one of them, the Muratorian fragment explicitly names, is Andrew. So let's go back to the feeding. Let's look at the story now that we've established why the heck is Philip showing up and why the heck is Andrew showing up. Where is this coming from? That'll actually help us get, again, and part of my goal, Stephen, is always to, if history is right, if the church's documents are right about how these gospels were written, who's involved, how it happened, I want to fact check them. Like, do we have evidence from inside the text that says to us, yeah, this has an insider's view that could be consistent with what we see in, like, say, the Muratorian fragment, the Anti-Marcionite prologue? Maybe. So let's test this theory. Where are we? We are now in a Passover feast, which is John's landmarks for telling Jesus' different ministries and miracles. Mm-hmm. He saw this crowd, and Jesus is now explicitly talking, not to a group, where Mark is speaking on Peter's perspective of what he thinks the group is thinking. Remember on the side I told you earlier that Luke kind of has like another insider? It seems like he may have had somebody else's perspective. Now, I'm going to pause here, and forgive me for inserting a theory. I'm not going to die on it.
Okay.
If Luke is the disciple that was with, or a disciple of Paul who traveled with him, he was the physician mentioned in Colossians. He was with him mentioned in Philemon. There is a lot of debate about who Philip is. Were there two Philips or one Philip? And if there were two Philips, were they both in Luke's number of the 70? Now, what's not disputed by the church fathers is whether or not there were two, or whether there was a Philip. Some would say the Philip in Acts chapter 8 is the same Philip in the Gospels. Some would say they're different. Some would say there are two Philips that are a part of the 70 or the 72, depending on which Greek manuscript you're reading. When Jesus sends them out 2 by 2, they would say that, well, there were two Philips. One was the Philip of the 12, and one was one of the Philip of the 70. And so the Philip in Acts is the Philip of the 70, but not necessarily in the 12. Regardless, did Luke meet a Philip in the book of Acts? The we, us, and our guy that wrote Acts. Did he spend time with Philip? The answer is yes, he did. Now, whether or not, again, we can debate which Philip this is. If you go to the book of Acts, you'll find that the we, us, and our guy that talks about Paul, whoever he is, say he's Luke, they spent a few days in Caesarea with Philip and his virgin daughters, which is probably where he got the information of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch and his preaching in Samaria. But here's an interesting point. Here's something to think about. Could Luke not, yes, he's following the template of the Petrine thought, but could he have had another man's perspective of the event that John unveils for us later? And could it be that Luke spent time with Philip and Philip was at this event and John's kind of telling us more of the insight? Because now John's going to focus on two guys, Andrew, Philip, who seem to be narrators involved in this compilation of John anyway. They're not following the template of Mark anymore. But could it be that Luke had access to both traditions? Even though John's after Luke, could he have had access to the traditions that were later put into John that came from the insider's view of Philip? Something to think about. Keep that in the back of our mind. All right, continue. John 6, 1-5. Again, I'm not saying you got to agree with me. I'm not saying I'm not even saying I'm right. I'm just saying, let's put all possibilities on the table. Let's connect some dots. Let's connect some contacts. Let's see if it's possible, if history is right. So he explicitly says to Philip, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? All right, go ahead and speak the controversy. I'm sure you have a couple statements on that. And I'm going to pull off the camera while you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument here is that the reason John is having Jesus turn to Philip is that John is aware of the fact that Philip is from Bethsaida and that this is interlocking with the geographical anchoring in Bethsaida that Luke presents. And that, but it seems like that assumes John is somehow independent of the synoptic tradition. And I believe Dan's response to that was, well, if you grant that John is aware of the synoptics, then he may just be actually, like, it could be a designed coincidence, in other words, like that John is actually corroborating the detail that's found in Luke, but he's doing it on purpose, or he has some other reason for Jesus to question, to question Philip that is not an undesigned coincidence, but that basically, like, you can't really hang your hat on Philip's identity as, originating from Bethsaida or Bethsaida.
All right, so let's let history speak again. If you would pull up my slides. I'm going to read Clement of Alexandria on this.
Hold on.
I don't think anybody can deny that John was aware of these Gospels. Clement says, of those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections. The tradition says that they took to writing out of necessity, which is what we just saw out of the Meritorian fragment. That it's not like John was like, yeah, let's put an account together. Everybody's like, please, let's put an account together. He did it out of necessity, probably because he was old and about to die, and your tradition dies with you if it's not written. Used all the time a message which was not written down, at last took to writing the following, because the three Gospels, which had been written down before, were distributed to all, including himself. It is said he welcomed them. This is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and testified to their truth, but said that there was only lacking to the narrative the account what was done by Christ at first at the beginning of the preaching. That's John the Baptist and what we see in John 1. They said accordingly that John was asked to relate in his own gospel the period passed over in silence by the former evangelists. So there is no doubt, based on Clement's understanding of John, that he knew of the three gospels, and he actually testified of those three gospels. Jerome pretty much says the same thing here. He talks about it when he's giving his introduction. It said that when there has said been another reason for his work, that when he, John, had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he approved indeed the substance of the history and declared that these things were true, but they had given the history only of 1 year, the one, that is, which follows the imprisonment of John, in which he was put to death, which is where exactly we are in this storytelling. So traditions are telling us that John's gospel was very much aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I shouldn't be shocked. I mean, you can stop sharing if you want and go back to John 6. But so we shouldn't be shocked, Stephen, to see this. However, they're also saying that he is filling in gaps that were missed by the others. Now, you can't do that unless you're an independent source that has your own, work. And that's what they're all telling us. Oh, that John and his brothers and his, all of these other people are with him, and they're telling, well, we got to get this done. We really need to teach your traditions that have not been written yet, because at that point, John was content with the three gospels. He didn't feel like any more needed to be done. So now you've got a group saying, well, let's all put our story into this. Let's tell it as we remember it. And so we kind of see evidence of this. And Philip is one of the first ones that shows up. Now, again, we do have this weird connection with Luke and John with the idea of Bethesda, the location of Philip. Philip and Luke apparently spent maybe some time together at some period in Caesarea, if they are the same people as they're alleged to be. Maybe there's a connection here even before John is written, where this tradition is being carried out, and Luke was able to preserve a pre-Johannine idea. And that could be the case. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying let's put it on the table and have these discussions. Now, the problem for me, where we get dismissive of like, oh, well, he could just be, doing something with the other three gospels. If you're asking me, do I believe that John knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke existed? Of course. He assumes they exist. When he tells you the story of Mary in chapter 12, that this is the one who anointed Jesus' feet, he doesn't even tell you that story until chapter 13.
Well,
but
when you say aware that they existed, you mean he actually read them, had access to them in written form?
Oh, yeah. I think he did. Yeah. I think that's what Clement's telling us. Jerome's telling us that. I think that the tradition is that John was very much aware of the other three, but he believed they lacked certain information that was not talked about. And he is coming behind it to tell information, not to repeat, but to inform more clarity. This is what he does for Mary, that she's the one that anointed Jesus' feet. This is what he does for Peter, who was the one that chopped off Malchus's ear. He now tells you both their names. And then he tells you why Peter was so anxious at the campfire and why he denied the Lord, because Malchus's relative is at the campfire, and the relative is like, aren't you? No, I'm pretty sure I saw you. The other gospels don't tell you that. John feels like he has to fill in gaps. Like he feels like he has to come in and cover times that weren't covered in the Synoptics, or cover details. John comes to the same passage. He doesn't feel like he needs to just repeat what Matthew and Mark and Luke have already said. They've established it. He wants you to know more explicit details for his purposes, and his agenda is very much different. So he comes in, and now he's going to actually expose the why factor. And now he brings Philip in the equation. He asked the question explicitly to Philip. Now he's telling you Philip's inside view. Mark has Peter. John has Philip. It seems like Luke has Peter and a little bit of hybrid of Philip. So now we get some independency involved in the story.
So that's a good pivot point to the Luke-John pairing here in Luke 22, John 13, right? Because this one is, so in John 13, on the eve of Passover during supper, Jesus rises from the table, removes his outer garment, ties a towel, pours water, and washes the disciples' feet, right? The act is preceded by elevated theological narration, emphasizing Jesus' knowledge of his divine origin, his cosmic authority, and impending return to the Father, right? He is, has foreknowledge here, divine foreknowledge in John, high Christology. Luke 22, during the Last Supper, a dispute over greatness arises among the disciples, and Jesus responds with teaching that contrasts Gentile lordship with servanthood, concluding, I am among you as one who serves. So the undesigned coincidence here is that, allegedly, that Luke preserves the occasion, which is the dispute over greatness, and the principle, the true greatness, consists in service, but there's no enacted illustration of this by Jesus, whereas John preserves the enacted illustration through foot washing, but there's no dispute over greatness. So basically, the undesigned coincidence view forces you to read John in light of Luke and import the scene of the dispute in order to understand what John is doing, what Jesus is doing in John through the foot washing. So that's how they're supposed to click. Like Luke allegedly explains why Jesus would perform a humiliating act, and then John allegedly shows how Jesus embodied the teaching Luke records. But neither gospel explicitly references the other detail. Now, what's your perspective on this one?
Well, it just continues to prove my point that John knows what Luke had, and that he is not seeking to repeat or create another synoptic situation as much as to build off of what was already established. And to tell you, John's more interested in the why than the what. Matthew, Mark, and Luke spend a lot of their time on the what happened, where it happened. John's interested in the why did Jesus heal? Why did Jesus feed? Why did Jesus say what he said, right? He's more interpreting. I think it was Burskog that said that John is more of an interpreter than he is a narrator. He's looking at the events through the eyes of what it meant, not so much although he does, he tells you what happens, but it's more about like, why did that happen? Because Jesus wanted you to know blank. So look at John's perspective. That's consistent with what we just read in Clement and others. Where is this timeline? Now, before the festival of the Passover, he's using his landmarks. Jesus knew that his hour had come and departed from this world and go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already decided. And he has this personal vindictive attitude toward Judas Iscariot constantly. So that he's constantly calling Judas Iscariot out, even when he's talking about Judas not Iscariot. He wants to put the not Iscariot in there just to make an elbow nudge at Judas Iscariot. John has this ongoing, rivalry, disgust with Judas Iscariot. And he wants you to know that, the devil had entered in, which, by the way, the only other gospel writer that tells that is Luke. They seem to, be consistent with each other here. But what do we see? Once again, we see John interpreting the situation, telling not a repeat, but an overview around the story, which speaks to its independency of content and event that is distinct from Luke, where now you have two people telling the same story incidentally about the same thing from different perspective and insight. And we don't have a copy and paste. That doesn't mean that John doesn't know what Luke put, but to put something in depth or more or less, or to add or to take a whole new dynamic from it, would indicate, even if you knew the other writing exists, you have an independent source to create the rest of the narration to be distinct. And therefore you have incidental consequential effects from both people's perspectives, because now you have two people telling the story, or more. In my case, for John, I think there's far more than one here. So I do think this is a good argument for undesigned coincidences.
But you believe that what John had in mind was the dispute, that the dispute was motivating the feet washing, and that John didn't, because my concern is that if you import the dispute into John from Luke, or assume that John has it in mind, I think you're overlooking his high Christology in verses 1 and 3.
He has. No. That goes back to the interpretation. John is interpreting the event. The event is that he's going to go more clearly in the next chapter. about the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit coming, I don't think that I think he's interpreting this whole thing based on timeline of we have now reached the last Passover before in which Jesus would die. Yeah. He knew his hour had come and now he's going to leave. So I get, maybe I'm not understanding your question, but like, I think he's interpreting the whole event instead of summarizing it and repeat.
I guess I just don't really feel the need to interpret John through Luke. Like I like getting John's message on his own terms and not kind of importing the dispute into it, because it's like if he's not mentioning it, it's for a reason. Like he wants to transition for Jesus knew the hour had come. All things were in his hands. Like he's reflecting this high Christology, and then he's lowering himself to washing the disciples' feet. It is not in a reaction to the dispute over who is greater, and that, it's like it's distinct. And I just like to have John, John evangelize in his own terms. Whether or not that doesn't invalidate Luke, in my opinion, it doesn't make the dispute less historical or reliable or whatever. I just don't think that dispute is in focus in John. And I don't think that
I don't either. Yeah. I don't think John is sitting here copying Luke. I don't even think he's looking at Luke, but he's looking, but that's the undesigned coincidence. They're both looking at the same event. And Luke has some source going after this discussion, this debate. John seems to not be caring about that at all. It doesn't mean he doesn't know that debate happened, but that's not the focus of his telling of that story. Luke goes in depth on Jesus breaking the bread and the wine. John doesn't even tell you that story. He tells you that story through another means, back in our other story of John 6. Whoever doesn't eat my flesh, drink my blood. So John is interpreting what happened at the Last Supper all the way back to previous teaching in chapter 6, the feeding. So no, I don't think John's sitting here like, oh yeah, what does Luke say? Okay, so I'm going to interpret Luke. I don't think he's interpreting Luke. I think he's interpreting the situation. He's not interested in the details. Again, remember what Clement and Jerome and others are telling us. He is not going to repeat what has already been established and he's agreed is true. He's going to go through times that are passed over by the other evangelists. He's going to spend more time dealing with the spirituality, in this case, the Christology of what has happened that night. That's what John's interested in. So I don't think he's depending on Luke at all. I don't think there's any dependence. I think it's independent. And I think that's why we have two independent accounts of what's happening that night that are so different, but yet they cross through the same event, which speaks to an undesigned coincidence of the same event.
I think maybe I'm misinterpreting the argument from an undesigned coincidence, but I think what they're saying is that the only way you can understand, or the way that they recommend you understand the foot washing illustration, is through the lens of the dispute. Like you have to assume that dispute is going on, even though John is not narrating it. And you also have to assume that in Luke that there was a foot washing procedure. That's like you have to harmonize them.
Well, I agree with that, but it doesn't mean they're depending. It doesn't mean that John is depending. He's assuming you've read it. Go one chapter over. Go one chapter or two chapters over in John. Let me give you a perfect example of what I'm talking about. John chapter 11, at the story of Martha, Lazarus, and Mary.
Wait, so back 2 chapters.
What did I say? We're 2.5 hours in. Forgive me if I'm saying crazy things.
All right, that's all right.
Go back two chapters.
All right, back 2 chapters. John 11, which verse?
Verse 2 of chapter 11.
Okay.
So we have, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Like, this is that Mary. Well, here's the problem. He doesn't tell you that story until the very next chapter in verses 1 through 8. But he assumes you know it. Why would he assume you know that? Because he's assumed you read the Synoptics. He's assuming his audience knows that. So if we could take that same understanding to the same situation you just put on the screen. It's not that in that moment of John 11, he's borrowing Matthew, Mark, and Luke and something like that. He's just notifying the woman that he hasn't had a chance to tell her story yet. But he assumes I
didn't put this up on screen.
You're good. he assumes you know the story of Mary's feet washing, even before he tells it. Where would he assume you read that? Well, he assumes you read it in the Synoptics. So John's gospel and Luke's gospel, he's not like depending on Luke. He's assuming the same thing he assumed about Mary in chapter 11, that you already know the story of the upper room. In fact, he assumes you know it so much, he doesn't even repeat, this is my body, which is going to be broken for. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant. He assumes you already know that part, doesn't even feel need to repeat it. In fact, he harmonizes that more in the teaching of the 5,000 that we just talked about. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. He has already, preceded that. John is doing a lot of assuming. He's assuming you already know. So there is a coincidence, if you will, an unintentional one for that. If you can understand that John assumes you already know Luke, not that he's borrowing or he's doing something, like maybe Dan would say, but you can see an undesigned coincidence here if you take into perspective that he assumes you've already know the story.
Got it. And then I guess I would love your perspective to push this along so we can wrap up. The passion narratives, the undesigned coincidence here is super interesting, where Mark 14:65 has some began to spit on Jesus and to blindfold him and strike him, saying to him, prophesy. The guards also took him and beat him. Mm-hmm. In Matthew, they add to that, prophesy to us, you Messiah, who is it that struck you? And then Luke adds the detail that they blindfolded him and then asked who it is that struck you. Now, the interesting thing is that Matthew removes the blindfolding detail, but puts in this question, who is it that struck you, which seems to assume that there was a blindfold.
He compresses it again. He's always compressing the details.
And then Luke restores the blindfold detail, but also keeps Matthew's, who is it that struck you? I just don't know, outside of redaction criticism, I think my note says like the undesigned coincidence proponent would argue like that Luke supplies a crucial detail that Jesus is blindfolded, which allegedly explains why the mockers say who has struck you. But that's not a detail that's a detail that Luke supplies, but it was originally
coming
stated
from
in Mark. Mm-hmm. So I understand that, yes, like Mark clicks with Matthew. Like, I don't know, it's an interesting overlap, this interlocking between the three gospels here. But I just don't know what I'm supposed to, like, what I need an undesigned coincidence.
I don't need one here. The only one that I find unique is verse 65. They kept heaping many other insults on him, which is not mentioned by either. Yeah. Which, once again, we kind of see perhaps that I think Luke was familiar with a couple of other eyewitnesses. He kind of gives himself away in Luke and Acts. Like if he comes across somebody, he kind of tells their story. Like Philip, we were just talking about Philip. He does the same thing with this random story about Cleopas on the road of Emmaus. He silences the name of the one and he gives credit to the other. And it seems like maybe he was the one that he had met and contacted and kind of gave him credit for that story. He does that. He seems to do that a lot here. He also continues to mention this Joanna woman at the resurrection tomb that is not in Matthew, not in Mark. And he establishes who she is very early on, that she is a supporter of Jesus' ministry financially. She's also married to somebody who's very important to Herod. And Joanna appears to be at this crucifixion and the resurrection. I often wonder on the, just kind of in a quick way, do I think it's necessary to have an undesigned coincidence here? No, but there are some nuances, and it's actually it's the last verse there in verse 65. They kept heaping many other insults on him. Luke is clearly not fully dependent on Mark or Matthew to add that detail. I could see where he kind of brings together Matthew, Mark in the blindfolding scene, redacts that, but not verse 65. Again, Luke is admitting to us that he is getting the information from many sources.
Yeah.
He's not content with just quoting Matthew or Mark or something like that. He wants to give his insiders discussions group their little 5-second heroics. We just saw it in the Feeding the 5,000. He mentions a location and he gets a chronology that nobody else, like, it seems like a dumb detail, unless maybe he was involved with Philip. Then it's not a dumb detail because now he's got all of the eyes kind of on it. He's kind of a wholesome look.
Yeah.
It seems like he has a wholesome look of this too, where many other things were going on that the other gospel writers didn't say. And he didn't want to spend his time like talking about them, just saying, just so you know, this just kept going. It's kept happening. But so that's the only part that's like unique to Luke that's different from others.
In the very last example is the Damascus escape, the Acts Paul dovetail.
Yeah, this is a good one. This is
also
a good one.
Super interesting. So undesigned coincidence proponents would compare Paul's autobiographical remark with Luke's narrative, where in Acts, after some time, the Jews plot to kill Saul in Damascus. They watch the city gates day and night to kill him, but the disciples lower him through an opening in the wall at night using a basket, allowing him to escape. So full, like a fleshed out historical narrative. And then in 2 Corinthians, Paul recounts that in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas guarded the city to seize him, but he escaped by being lowered in a basket through a window in the wall. So Acts explains how Paul escaped. Paul explains why Damascus authorities were involved. And I guess here I would just raise the question of, like, I believe the author of Luke Acts was at the very least familiar with Paul's letters, if not personally acquainted with Paul. I think proponents of undesigned coincidences would also agree with that.
Yes, they would.
So what do we need an undesigned coincidence for? Like, I mean, I get, yes, it's interlocking. It's totally overlapping.
It's an overlap.
It's an overlap, really extreme detail. But what does the undesigned coincidence model explain that is not explained by author of Acts knew 2 Corinthians or knew the narrative in 2 Corinthians, either by reading the letter or knowing, what, like, I guess it all goes back to, like, okay,
if there was dependency on the letter, then there would just be what we see in Matthew and Mark over and over and over and over. Very, just either a summary or shorter. If you think 2 Corinthians is before Acts, then you would expect 2 Corinthians to be the shorter rendition that is compressed it. Or excuse me, Acts would be the shorter that compressed 2 Corinthians. In fact, that's not. We actually have more detail in Acts than we do in 2 Corinthians. So if he's copying him or if he's doing something that is just simply based on, like, this is a reliability on the text, not a person, not a story, not a teller, not an eyewitness, then you're going to look at like a Matthew Mark situation where it's virtually the same thing with a compressed style to it. But that's not what we find. We actually find explanation. We find key figures. We find the location, the timing at night versus not saying at night. So these are not just like Acts is depending on 2 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians is depending on it, however you want to argue it. Because if that's the case, there's so much distinction here where there has to be an open door for uniqueness.
Well, I don't think there's any, I mean, is there a dating model where 2 Corinthians post-dates Acts? I think.
I'm just giving latitude to anybody who wants to argue differently. I mean, no, there shouldn't be. Well, I don't know. I mean, 2 Corinthians is kind of odd, but I think, I don't know. I mean, I can argue either way, but I don't want to get into the dating of the writings of Paul versus Luke and Acts. I think Luke and Acts is earlier, of course, than most people.
When do you date it?
60s.
60s.
Mm-hmm.
But that would still be after 2 Corinthians, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Luke was written. I think Luke was written while 2 Corinthians was being distributed, and I think 2 Corinthians is actually kind of it's kind of a hybrid letter, if you would. Yeah. I think it's kind of anyway. But
well, I've kept you close to 3 hours, and thank you to everybody who joined and listened, and thank you for the super chats, for the birthday birthday love. And I don't know, like, do you think, I think it's good. Like, I was really into, there was a period in like the, 2020 when people were like actively writing blog posts, and this was a hot topic at that point, and I was really into it because I'm really into the Gospels, and I wanted everybody to be talking about it, and so I'm glad it's sort of coming back around, uh, thanks to Dan and Wes. Like, I think it's good that they're arguing. I don't. I wish it weren't so much of this, like, kind of like, oh, well, you're ignorant of this, and then you're out of your element, and like, I think we could go without the personal insults and just have people like connect and actually talk to each other. But I get it. It's fun. It's fun. I don't know. I'm enjoying
Well, I go back
from
to
the
what I
sidelines.
said. What I said when we first started. There's overstated examples of undesigned coincidences. It's overstated where it's not necessary. You can still have an eyewitness perspective that is independent in certain details, distinct from the dependency that comes from Mark or whatever. On the other hand, there can be the waving of the hand, where we see distinctions like the last one you just showed and go, no, that's not possible. There's no undesigned coincidence here. But you can't explain it by dependency, because the dependency works in an opposite direction of all these other dependencies that we've already looked at. And they're not actually lining up in the way that that would go, because Acts being later would have been a compressed version, not a detailed version. If there was dependency, there would have been a furthering of things. So it's an inconsistent approach. So we can't just go, well, then it's not an undesigned coincidence. I don't think it is, right? Well, no, you can't do that. You have to at least give it the opportunity to be true, because of the distinction, because of the uniqueness, because they wove into the same story, but coming at it with different, even if you believe Paul is behind both, and I do, there's still a uniqueness of the writer that's distinct from how Paul wanted it told in his own writing, as opposed to somebody who may be traveling with Paul, who got it from him, who's telling it from his inside perspective of how he wants it to be described.
I guess I just expected you to be more. I assumed you were going to be a stronger component of undesigned coincidences than you turned out to be.
I'm not against them. I think you've heard me at certain points saying, well, that's undesigned coincidence. I was like, well, yeah, I agree. But, and I like to nuance it, because if the point of all of this doesn't lead us to the historical arguments that we are being told that these gospels have been put together, like what I read in the Muratorian fragment, the Anti-Marcionite prologue, Papias, Clement, Jerome, Irenaeus of Lyons, whoever, I want to fact check. We have historic claims about how these gospels were composed and by whom they were composed. And it's not as clean as just, well, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah, they're a little bit more complex than that. But if they are from where they tell us they are coming from, and these are the successors of the apostles themselves through history and over a 200-year period, and their texts and their traditions have been carried on in these churches, we need to fact check and say, does the internal evidence consistently harmonize with the external claim? And what I'm looking for is, do we find consistent, like I demonstrated with Peter and his insight perspective, or Luke maybe having crossed paths with Philip, who we get introduced to at the beginning of John's gospel with Andrew. And now we have this insider's worldview. And now it's like, well, maybe we do have some eyewitness testimony here that is consistent with each other, but yet crosses over each other in these stories, but doesn't do it exactly the same, where they're clearly not depending on each other, like John and Luke, like you mentioned, or like Acts and 2 Corinthians. Like, you can look at this and go, there is undesigned coincidences, but what's the point at the end of the day of the undesigned coincidence? It's to show that authentic storytelling is happening from an insider's view, from an eyewitness perspective. And my concern with the undesigned coincidences is that we're focusing so much on the coincidences that we miss the point. And the point is that if the gospels are based on eyewitness testimony, we should expect details that are distinct and unique that cross into the same storytelling from a different perspective, different detail, different idea, different place, different location. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I have a more nuanced version of undesigned coincidences. And I can hear McClatchy calling me right now saying, well, you don't exactly understand undesigned coincidences the way that we're teaching. And that's fine. I'm sure that's the case. But my greatest purpose in the Gospels isn't to prove undesigned coincidences, although I think they're an aid to the main point, and that is, do we have reliable Gospels based on eyewitness testimony? Do the historical accounts align with the internal evidence through undesigned coincidences and things of such sort, other techniques that prove the historic claim to be right? And if they do, then we have an internal and external consistency, and therefore we have reliable accounts. They may not be perfect in some people's minds. You might have imperfections. You might have details that were wrong. But at the end of the day, you have people that were there telling you what happened, and therefore we have the closest thing to accuracy you could possibly get. And that is what I'm contending for.
Well, and we also have, like you mentioned, about how Mark, was in order, that you mentioned the ordering of Mark. I also think there's value in looking very carefully at Mark's chiastic structure, about how he's actually crafting his narrative in a creative way that really tells an engaging story and progresses you. He pushes you through his narrative. He's like, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then this interlocks with that, and then and then there's something in the middle of that chiastic structure that's like the point that there's a reason why he's enveloping these points in the chiasms. That I also think that, like, if you overlook that because you don't like the implication of an author actually skillfully crafting a story, I think you're also kind of missing the forest for the trees, because I think that also happens with, Matthew doesn't necessarily obey Mark's chiasms, and he compresses, and then Luke comes over and just does a complete, I go back and forth between whether or not, like, Mark's my favorite, Luke's my favorite, and there's things about John that I like, but
Luke's my favorite.
Yeah. And Luke's definitely the most, like, skillful, rhetorician.
Oh, sure.
But I think, that's I think that it's overall helpful that everyone is talking about this, and it's helpful for for Wes Huff to sort of start the little drama, and it gets the buzz is good. It's good to have buzz and interest around this topic. Even if at the end of the day, I just hope at the end of the day we don't end up in a situation where everybody has to pick sides, and that it becomes prerequisite of Christians to believe in undesigned coincidences in the exact way that they do. Obviously, you have a nuanced take on that, so I'm glad you presented that. But just because you happen to, agree with Dan on certain points, or you acknowledge that there's some invoking of the Old Testament or literary redaction, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are, you're not a bad person. You're not like, not Christian just because you hold those views. I mean, you can hold different views from different camps.
I don't know if any of them would say that. I mean, having known Eric or Wes, I don't know if they would ever say that.
I don't know if they would either. It just seems to me like once a topic like this becomes, a pet peeve of someone, and then it's like, okay, now everyone on the apologetics side of the aisle is all falling in line with this, this position or this, thought system. That it sort of, everybody feels the need to, like, oh, okay, well, I guess I need to, it's sort of tribalism.
Yeah, but I think that the mistake in that is that Christianity, when it comes to the Gospels, is not hinging on a single piece of evidence.
Yeah.
The Gospels cannot be defended by a single piece of evidence or a single technique or a single attestation of the church fathers or one validating comment. Like it takes a corroborating of the evidence. It is looking at the internal evidence. It's looking at the external evidence. It's looking at the claims about and within. And so to me, like, I guess I don't romanticize undesigned coincidences, because no more than I romanticize the quote I showed you from the Muratorian fragment. I think it's important. I think it's a piece. I think it's part of bringing all the content to the table and seeing how it plays out. But at the end of the day, the gospel reliability is not hinging on the Muratorian fragment. It's not hinging on undesigned coincidences. It is another aid to the arguments and puzzles of creating a greater and clearer picture of the reliability of them. And so I'm not as like, oh my gosh, if we don't have undesigned coincidences, we just don't have the gospels. Like, I don't think that at all. I think that the gospels were defended for a very long time without all of this kind of language.
Yeah.
So I think it's an accumulative case to build, and it is a piece, an important piece, but only a piece to the whole thing.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If anybody in the audience has lasted this long, please make sure you like the video and subscribe to Cross Bible, subscribe to Facts with Stephen Boyce, and thank you very much for joining on this post-Christmas, pre-birthday stream. It was a pleasure having you.